Be seated. Dr. the Honorable Keith Christopher Rowley, Prime Minister of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, the Honorable Colum Imbere, Minister of Finance, Honorable Ministers, Chief Secretary, Tobago House of Assembly, High Commissioners and Ambassadors, members of the Tobago House of Assembly, Permanent Secretaries, Mayors of City Corporations and Boroughs, senior government officials, heads of organizations, members of the media, and members of the viewing and listening public. Good morning. It is indeed an honor to be given the opportunity to be Master of Ceremonies and moderator for today's proceedings. My name is Ken Simmons. And just to give an idea of what to expect from today's proceedings, a comprehensive overview of the economic landscape going forward will be shared and discussed. Also, industry leaders will be sharing their ideas and recommendations based on what is revealed today. And later on in the program, we will be giving some of you the opportunity to ask your questions to any member of the panel. We begin our proceedings today with opening remarks from the Honorable Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, Dr. Keith Christopher Rowley, who was born on October 24th, 1949 in Mason Hall, Tobago, and was raised by his grandparents who were prominent Tobago farmers. Dr. Rowley completed his secondary schooling at Bishop High School, Tobago, and his sterling academic performance saw him capture the prestigious Sylvan Bowles Scholarship at Bishop's High School. He then commenced his studies at the University of the West Indies, Mona, Jamaica, from where he graduated with a Bachelor of Science in Geology, first-class honors, Geography, first-class honors, and a Master's in Volcanic Stratigraphy at the UWI in St. Augustine. He's a volcanologist who obtained his doctorate in geology, specializing in geochemistry. As a research scientist, he held the position of research fellow and later head the seismic research unit at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine. He was also the general manager of state-owned National Quarries Company Limited. He first ran for political office in 1981, where he contested the Tobago West seat. To date, Keith Rowley has the distinction of being the only People's National Movement candidate to have contested a seat in a general election in both Tobago and Trinidad. Dr. Keith Christopher Rowley is the member of the House of Representatives for Diego Martin West in the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago, where he has represented that constituency since 1991, having been re-elected in 1995, 2000, 2001, 2002, 2007, 2010, 2015, and most recently in 2020. Ladies and gentlemen, the Honorable Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, Dr. Keith Christopher Rowley.
Honorable Colum Imbere, Minister of Finance, other members of the Cabinet, Chief Secretary of the Tobago House of Assembly, High Commissioners and Ambassadors to Trinidad and Tobago, members of the Tobago House of Assembly, Permanent Secretaries and other senior government officials, mayors of city corporations and boroughs, heads of missions, members of the media, and particularly members of the viewing and listening public of Trinidad and Tobago. Permit me to introduce myself as the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago with the onerous responsibility of ultimately being responsible for the Minister of Finance and for what the Minister of Finance does and doesn't do. Today, we are met here to have a little overview of the assignment which the Minister of Finance will be charged with in allocating, after obtaining the resources, to service the country for the next 12 months. This servicing of the country by way of parliamentary intervention is called the national budget in local parlance. And the budget is meant to be all things to all men, all women, and all children. Recently, we have been going along relatively steadily in a budgeting exercise every 12 months in a particularly difficult period for Trinidad and Tobago, that difficulty having been noticed as it commenced in 2014. There was a general election in 2015, and the difficulties continued into that year and worsened. So by 2015, December, we were in our worst position in about a 10-year period. However, we have been grappling with those difficulties, trying as far as we were able to preserve the gains that we have made, to grow the national pie, to prevent the collapse of the weak areas, and to ensure that opportunity exists as far as we were able to for all those who were seeking to engage themselves in the national pastime of economic and personal development. But this year, fiscal year 2019 into 2020, we had only one reasonable quarter, one normal quarter. That quarter was October to December. For as we entered 2020, for the last 9 months, as a nation, as a people, as a world, we have been required to deal with an unusual situation, an unplanned eventuality, which has the effect of making additional demands on the resource base of the country. Under normal circumstances, if one considers the period 2010 to 2015, and then 2015 to 2019 as normal, one would have seen that the period 2015 onwards was a little abnormal in that, while not being unique, but we were in fact in a situation of spending more than we were earning, but supporting that gap by advance payments, you may call it that, but fiscally put the borrowings. We were borrowing money to add to what we were earning to meet the level of expenditure. That is not an unusual situation in the management of countries. While one would prefer to be in a situation of fiscal surpluses, if you do find yourself with national programs and priorities, especially developmental programs, and you have to borrow, as long as you're in a position to service those loans and to be reasonably comfortable that you had a revenue stream that will support your borrowings, that aspect of international acceptance of management was not unusual. But then comes COVID-19. And in addition to the borrowing that we had to do to be where we were in the first quarter of 2019-2020, which is the end of the calendar year of 2019. In addition to the borrowing that we had to do in that gap, we had the desperate situation of having to find resources from all sources to be used immediately to save life and livelihood in the 3 quarters of 2020. That is the scenario of 2020. In fact, many people are beginning to erase 2020 as a lost year. But if it was as simple as that 2020 was the last year, that would not have been a problem by itself. It's not only a lost year in some aspects, but it took with it a lot of what the other years could have laid claim to. And it's against that background that we met very early in the realization of the effect of this pandemic. It not being only a health issue, but an economic avalanche that was not going uphill, but downhill. That we met here in Trinidad and Tobago under the guidance of the government officers to look at our circumstance, to project the future, and to prepare to deal with a difficult, unique future. I make reference here to the National Recovery Roadmap, where a number of citizens, those who have had experience and expertise, agreed to come together as a team to look at Trinidad and Tobago's position in these circumstances that I've just described, and to very carefully, without personal or sectoral agendas, to look at a national agenda as to how we can cope with the difficulties that were forecast ahead. We received the draft document from that team, and that document was laid in the Parliament, and it formed the basis of how the government functioned between then and now. The finalization of that report has now been in hand, and today the Ministry of Public Administration, that minister who is on that committee, would make available to the public, to the media, to the nation as a whole, all the details, including the working submissions of what was said to the country by the Roadmap and Recovery team. So we are not operating by VAPs, as some would have you believe. We are not operating vai, as some would believe. We might not be magicians, but we are responsible at the level of the cabinet, at the level of the business community, at the level of NGOs, and those who look out for Trinidad and Tobago. It is a difficult period. Now, budgeting is not a mysterious exercise. It might bring mysteries, but it's not a mysterious exercise. Budgeting is about acquiring assets on the revenue side, resources, which will be used on the expenditure side. But there's one interesting thing that those of us who've been involved in budgeting, as well as being involved in the Parliament and being responsible for the population at the constituency level, what we know is that on the revenue side of budgeting, there's always a question mark as to whether the revenues would be realized or can be realized. But on the expenditure side, the demands tend to be more permanent, more firmed up. So when the public servants make the proposals to the Ministry of Finance and the other ministries, Ministry of Planning and Development and others, and they come up with this balancing act of numbers on the revenue side coming in and numbers on the expenditure side going out, it usually is arithmetic. But after that, operations will determine whether the revenue side will be realized. But the minute the budget is passed and allocations are authorized by the Parliament, demands are being made right then and there. In some instances, without reference to the fact that those demands are in fact based on expectations of estimates that were made of circumstances that may not be realized. How much tax we can collect from X and from Y? What state will the economy, the local economy be in? What state will the external economy be in? The external markets into which we sell. Would they have prices that will give us the kind of outturns where the government can get the levels of taxes? These are assumptions that we make on the revenue side. And we have to carry those assumptions across to the expenditure side, but not very many people listen to that argument that the assumption on the revenue side is a cousin, close relation of the assumptions on the expenditure side. Parliament makes the appropriations, makes it legal for ministries to spend what has been allocated. And there's a bracket there which, if it has been realized on the revenue side. Now, in Trinidad and Tobago, there's no gainsaying the fact that the state is the major contributor to the national economy. Trinidadians and Tobagoans might not accept that as a useful statement. But there are economies, even here in the Caribbean, where the state is not the major driver of the economy. The private sector is. And therefore, if the state has difficulties and the private sector is doing well, then the country can do well. But in countries like Trinidad and Tobago, where the state is the major contributor to the economy, in more ways than one, in Trinidad and Tobago's case, one can go as far as to say directly. Because government's injection into the economy through the national budget every 12 months is the fuel that drives the engine of our economy. Government is also the largest employer of labor in the country, and in many cases, the largest investor in national infrastructure development and economic infrastructure as well. So in Trinidad and Tobago, while that is the picture, the government also, over time, has assumed more and more personal responsibilities funded from the National Treasury. That is all well and good if it can be financed, if it can be afforded, and of course, if it can be sustained. In this period of 2020, a lot of what we have been doing cannot be sustained in the way that we have been sustaining them. Much as we would like to, we would have to make difficult decisions. 2019, even before COVID-19, we were realizing this, and we were making some of those decisions. I dare mention the government's decision to restructure Petrotrin. That was a decision made against the background that we just couldn't go on that way. There are many other areas in the national activity, economic, social, financial, which cannot go on that way simply because they all require funding. They all make claims on the expenditure side. They all make claims on the resources of the nation, which the government is in charge of by trust. And if the resources are not there, the obvious thing that one expects is that we will have to cut our suit to suit our cloth. And that is why at the Recovery Committee meetings, one of the agreements was that for the next budget, the Minister of Finance will have to tell the country in straight, unvarnished terms just how much money is available to be appropriated in the national budget. In other words, let's face reality. How much do we have to allocate on the revenue side, whether it is from tax take or from borrowings? What is the inflow that is available for the next 12 months? And when that is made known, then how do we apportion it to the things that we have been doing or that we want to do? But most importantly, what are the priorities? But we can't just budget for 1 year. The arithmetic might apply to 1 year, 2021, 2021. But whatever we do in this fiscal year, we have to keep our eyes on the years ahead as well, because we want to make it through this night. and get to the days that follow to have those days to contribute to our livelihood and to our lives. And that is why the budget of 2020 into 2021 ought not to be seen as only treating with the symptoms or the ailments of this year. They have to also look at the following years. So I ask you to bear that in mind. But I also ask you to bear in mind that if we agree that we are making the best decision that's available, we then have to agree on the priorities. What are the priorities? And if we choose the priorities against the background and the knowledge that there's never any one way in this decision-making exercise, and that there are a series of options always available. So don't be surprised if, as the Minister of Finance speaks today, and you get indications as to where he's heading or what he's going to do with the national budget, that you hear other conversations, other recommendations, some even made in anger from sectors. It simply means that different people have different priorities where they may be located. The government is in the center of the interests of the people of Trinidad and Tobago, and the priorities that we will choose as government is against the background that we do not want to unduly affect any individual or sector, leave no one behind. But the decisions and the priorities are to give all of us a chance to survive and to prosper. So the priorities will include ensuring that we service our national debt, because to not do that is to create a new calamity to add to whatever we have facing us now. It is paying for money that we borrowed and spent at an earlier time, hopefully, spent usefully. But the priority that the national debt places on us allows us to intervene and to participate in the international economy. If we do not service our national debt or put ourselves in a situation where our national debt cannot be serviced by our own actions, there are consequences to that. The most obvious consequence is to ask for help. And you know where that help comes from. It comes from a place which brings with it more pain, more suffering in a shorter space of time than we could ever prescribe for ourselves. So we have to manage that. That's a priority. The other priority is national security. If we are not safe and secure, hale and hearty or sick, then our circumstance would not be enviable. Then we also have to ensure that the next generation have an opportunity to grow and to prosper. So we make sure we look after our children. But in doing all of this, we have to make sure that we stay healthy. So health is also a priority. And there's one other area of priority, and that is that we have to ensure that those members of the national community who are least able to look after themselves get some measure of assistance to live with dignity amongst us in Trinidad and Tobago. So all of us have a responsibility to all of them, whoever they might be, that whatever we take from the national treasury, from the national resource pool, that we don't take only for ourselves, but we ensure that some is left for the least of those who can or cannot look after themselves. And that is why the social support system would remain a priority. Because if the economy loses the input from the large number of people who rely on their government checks, if those people are lost, then that is a huge loss to the prospering part of the economy, because they are consumers. And in our kind of economy, as the consumption takes place, the economic fuel is added, and the wheels will turn. I, as Prime Minister, would ask the national community to be responsible, to be patient, and also to accept the reality of our circumstance. What COVID-19 is doing to us now is not peculiar to Trinidad and Tobago. It's doing it to countries, I can say virtually every country around the world. Different countries are responding in probably slightly different ways, but the negative effects are there. You only have to look at the news. But I dare say that in Trinidad and Tobago, we have been spared a lot of what others are realizing. And we will not help our cause by pretending that this is not so. We will be better off accepting the reality, facing up to it, doing what has to be done as dictated by the circumstances beyond our control, and making those best decisions, selecting those priorities, and ensuring that we put Trinidad and Tobago's people's interests first. And that is why I have not seen the final numbers yet from the Minister of Finance, so I'm not going to tell any tales out of school. I'm like you. I'm waiting to hear what he has to say. But I know that the Minister of Finance in this government will ensure that provisions are made for the priorities I've mentioned. But we also have to create opportunities for employment. We can't just focus on funding those who fortunately are already on the national nipple. We have to cater for those who are off the dining table by creating opportunities for them to come to mealtime. And that is why it doesn't matter how stringent the budget is, on the recurrent side, we have to have a development program. Because in that development program would be the opportunities for medium and temporary employment. So you would see the Minister of Finance funding construction of infrastructure, housing, and other kinds of expenditure in a development program, which is in addition to funding the commitments where you pay out without a return in the physical side of improvement in the country. That development program will create the employment that we so sorely needed on the government side. And I expect that the Minister of Finance will also intervene to encourage expenditure in the private sector to bring about investments which in themselves will create more opportunities for employment, because employment creation is one of the assignments, urgent assignments of this era, if we are not to leave others behind. This budget is one that will tax the public service, it will tax the Minister of Finance, and it will tax the government's resolve. I simply want to say that this government is resolved to ensure that Trinidad and Tobago has and gets the leadership it requires, the commitment that it deserves in a period of unique difficulty. This is 2020. This is a period where it is very many years that we have been budgeting with a deficit. It's been a long time since we've had a surplus on our national budget. But in the meantime, we have increased the government's commitment for additional service to the population. We are all in this together. Some of the things that we had become accustomed to in times of plenty cannot now be had because it's not available. But what we want to make sure is available is decision-making that gives us the best chance to overcome all of these difficulties. It is said that there are opportunities that would have appeared on the horizon and in front of our faces by the circumstances thrust upon us by the difficulties of the international market and the difficulties of the COVID virus and other difficulties. Let us take the opportunity to make those opportunities, to make those other opportunities encourage us to make changes which otherwise we may not have made because our comfort zone may have caused us to postpone those decisions. A lot of decision-making would have been postponed because we could have afforded to postpone them. It is said. Maybe we could not have, but we thought we could have. But now, even if we would like to postpone them for one reason or another, the circumstances are saying to us that some decisions are required to be made now if tomorrow is not to make more difficult decisions. The demands on us which we would not want to face for having not made decisions that we should have made now. So today, I've seen it said that it's unusual that we should be having a spotlight on the budget before the budget. We should have had a budget and then we have a spotlight on what the Minister of Finance presents. That's one way of looking at it, and that will happen, whether we label it spotlight or not. The minute the Minister of Finance stops speaking in the Parliament, there will be a period of intense national discussion on what he has actually said and what decisions have been made. But today's decision is to assist us in understanding why the decisions that he has to make are being made, because an understanding would put us in a better position to work with it. It puts us in a better position to know what our limits are and what the limitations are, how generous we can be, what we can sustain, and what we need to prune out. So, having said that, it is not for me to preempt the officer of state whose responsibility it is to, having had the discussions with his colleagues and others, to have put together a package, but against the policy positions of the government, which says, yes, we will continue to hold certain responsibilities. Yes, we will have to probably give up some responsibilities that the government would have assumed. But we will also ensure that every effort is made to accumulate the resources that are available to the people of Trinidad and Tobago, and that we'll apportion them on the expenditure side with the best priority yardsticks. I thank you for coming, I thank you for listening, I thank you for viewing, and I hope that you will stay with us, because an educated population is a population that will make the best decisions in any circumstance. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Honorable Prime Minister. We now have a presentation from the Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Finance, Mr. Vishnu Danpal. Mr. Vishnu Danpal returned in January 2017 as Head of Permanent Secretary to the Ministry of Finance, a place where he has spent most of his public service life. Outside of the Ministry of Finance, Mr. Danpal has diligently served as Permanent Secretary at the Ministry of Energy and Energy Affairs and the Ministry of Public Utilities. Mr. Danpal is also a former member, staff of the Executive Director's Offices of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank Group in Washington, D.C. He's currently a director on the Caribbean Airlines Limited Board and former president of TIDCO and the Tourism Development Company. Ladies and gentlemen, please show some love for the Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Finance, Mr. Vishnu Danpal.
Dr. the Honorable Keith Christopher Rowley, Prime Minister of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, the Honorable Colman Brett, Minister of Finance, Honorable Ministers, Chief Secretary, Tobago House of Assembly, High Commissioners and Ambassadors, members of the Tobago House of Assembly, permanent secretaries, mayors of city corporations and boroughs, senior government officials, heads of organizations, the media, members of the viewing and listening public. Good morning. Today, I'll be presenting on a very interesting topic, and I'll be pitching the presentation as in previous spotlights, not necessarily to the members of academia, but to the, let's say, the ordinary citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. It's a very interesting topic, and it's part of our very popular refrain in Trinidad and Tobago, using the distinct vernacular, where the money go on. Is it a mystery, or some people, some commentators suggested, is it mischief? Next slide, please. In the previous spotlight, the Ministry of Finance introduced this budget to the national community. And just to interject here a bit, just from the topic alone, it's an interesting topic because as the Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Finance, I'm guided by the Exchequer and Audit Act, I'm guided by financial regulations, I'm guided by several pieces of call circulars, financial call circulars. I'm guided by the Budget Division, the Treasury, also guided by Treasury Solicitor, of course the Auditor General, and obviously the several Joint Select Committees of Parliament. So there are many, many checks and balances. As I was saying, we introduced this graph at the previous spotlight. And it showed very distinctively, in 2011, the level of oil and gas revenue as a percentage of total revenue stood at around 42 billion. Fell drastically in 2016 to around 7.6 billion. And started to pick back up from 2017 to present. And that is essentially because of the impact of 12.5% royalty across the board on the energy sector, as well as, interestingly, very interestingly, the introduction of Heritage Petroleum and their ability to pay taxes. Next slide, please. We also introduced this graph in a previous spotlight. And it shows the level of expenditure went up in 2014 to over 60 billion. And in 2018, government took it down to under 50 billion. In any economy, that's a drastic decline that most economies may not be able to handle. But as I will show subsequently, there are certain things, as the Honourable Prime Minister said before, and I have to quote him, if I may, Prime Minister, on a statement you made recently, if I could paraphrase you. The Ministry of Finance is not for the faint-hearted, and we have decisions to make. Next slide, please. So what I'll do is summarize very quickly in a very simple way, using a very simple tables, central government's fiscal operations for 2020, the estimates, and show you how, very simply, a budget is broken down. Next slide. Let's start with the income side. Budget is based, obviously, on assumptions. Two of the major assumptions would be the price of gas and the price of oil. The original budget estimates 2020, and then the revised estimates. The original budget was based on $60 for the price of oil, US dollars for the price of oil, and $3 per MMBTU, US dollars, for the price of gas. Because of the circumstances brought about by the pandemic, we had to recalibrate the budget in April. The budget was recalibrated on US $45 per barrel and US $180 per MMBTU for gas. And you can see the change in the income, a $14 billion hole in income as a result of that recalibration. And those were, and this is where I was speaking about the harsh decisions had to be made. Next slide, please. So now, the intent for the fiscal year is to keep the budget around $50 billion. The original estimate was 53. The intent is to keep the budget around $50 billion. And just remember, the recalibrated income is now 33, which leaves us with a deficit of $17.3 billion, or 10% of GDP, roughly 10%, up from $5.2 billion, or roughly a little above 3% of GDP. Now, the issue with that, as the Honorable Prime Minister pointed out, is the capital program. And I'll show further what I mean by that. You don't want to impact on your capital program, your public sector investment program, because that's where the investments in the country are generated. That's where you provide the level of employment generation that the country is looking forward to, that the country requires. But to understand it better, I've broken it down into a very simple monthly cash flow. So you'll understand literally, in the vernacular, where the money going. Next slide, please. Sorry, wrong slide. Come on, again. One after this, please. Right. It's an income slide. Next one. Next one. Sorry. Right. And just to show you the financing table, how this budget is financed is through external borrowing or domestic borrowing. And you see here the row with the Heritage and Stabilization Fund, you see zero. And for analytical purposes, when the budget division, when they do estimates, they leave out the withdrawals from Heritage and Stabilization Fund until the final numbers are in. Next slide, please. So let us look at very simple cash flow, monthly cash flow. I chose the first 3 months of the calendar year. Let's call them the pre-COVID months. I chose the quarter three, the 3 months, let's call them during COVID months. During the first 3 months, as you would see there, we have broken it down into mandatory expenditure and discretionary expenditure. The average mandatory expenditure, and you see mandatory expenditure defined there. Previous slide, please. The previous slide. Just one sec. Right. I've defined mandatory expenditure there. But just to let you know, the average for the year for monetary expenditure is about $3.5 billion per month, if you average it off. So, hypothetically speaking, without collecting a dollar from the Board of Inland Revenue, the Ministry of Finance knows that next month we are facing a bill of $3.5 billion without earning a dollar. And then we have discretionary expenditure, which is based after the fact on how much funding remains. Next slide, please. So monetary expenditure. We have the direct charges outlined there, which are charges outside the appropriation bill, which are charges laid down by Parliament. And some of these charges are pensions for public servants, payment to, just an example, the President's House, the judiciary, the Defense Force, etc. So once those direct charges must be included every month. And then you have the appropriated mandatory charges. And that will include personal expenditure, public servants, goods and services to keep the ministries in operation. Then you have current transfers and subsidies. And these would be several state enterprises that are provided with subventions from the state. You have then you have the social grants. Very interestingly, this would entail old age pension, public assistance grant, disability grant, the food card, and then salary related, meaning we pay salaries for many state enterprises. And we also contribute to the debt servicing of many state enterprises. And you see the figures there. And then the statutory boards. We do this similar exercise. Salaries and debt. And the main statutory board here, which would probably can probably take up the entire thing, would be the Water and Sewerage Authority. And then, under monetary expenditure, obviously, must include the Tobago House of Assembly. So, let us just summarize that. So, just direct charges, appropriated funds, mandatory expenditure, including the Tobago House of Assembly. We are down to $3.5 billion a month on average. Next slide, please. So what does that leave for discretionary? Discretionary expenditure becomes a residual factor based on the level of income that the country has or the ability to borrow. So then you'll hear ministries complaining that they have problems with goods and services, mining equipment purchases, current transfers and subsidies again to state enterprises, statutory boards. And this is where the issue comes in on how much more after monetary expenditure, how much more discretionary expenditure we could afford. That's the issue. And inside of this discretionary expenditure, you'll have many ministries, obviously, wondering why they're not getting their releases. This is the reason here on the table. Next slide, please. So now we look at the inflows. So we have the total inflows there, and they're all defined in the column. And you can see that many times, many months, or those, in fact, the entire 6 months, the total inflows do not match the total expenditure or the total outflows. And the total inflows, in many cases, you see there, based on the level of collections by the Inland Revenue Department, customs, value-added tax, etc., etc. It's well defined there. So the summary table, next slide, we point out very clearly the issue. And the issue is that you have total inflows on a monthly basis, total outflows on a monthly basis, and as you can see, it's been a shortfall for the entire year. And part of that also includes refinancing of debt. And so what do you do when you have this level of shortfall on a monthly basis? And this is after you collected all your revenue for the month. And just a quick explanation. I chose this month specifically because what January, let's for explanations, January is what we call the start of the quarter month. February, obviously, the middle month, and March, where the main taxpayers, the income from the main taxpayers will come in. It's the end of quarter month, similarly June. But then when you have a month like January, where the major form of revenue that will come in on the 21st of a beginning of quarter month will be royalties. And then you have the middle month, which is February or May, where very little revenue will come into March, the level of expenditure, then you know you're going to be in a bit of problems. You're going to be in some problems. So, looking at this summary, we're now going to have to try and finance. I'm going to try to explain how it's financed, how we finance the shortfall. And this is essentially where the money gone. Next slide, please. So how do we finance our shortfall? Well, we borrow externally to not only finance debt, but we borrow for budgetary support. We use the withdrawals from Heritage and Stabilization Fund, and I'll come back to that because there's another piece of vernacular that comes up. The Ministry of Finance is raiding the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. I'll deal with that. And we do domestic financing, bond issues, as I said, to refinance the debt as well as budgetary support. And as I mentioned, let me deal a bit with the Heritage and Stabilization Fund and the fact that commentators say the Ministry of Finance is raiding the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. Far from the truth. Next slide, please. In May, when the Minister of Finance went to Parliament in March to amend the legislation governing the Heritage and Stabilization Fund, to move away from the normal mechanics of withdrawals from the Heritage and Civilization Fund, to include a situation of pandemics, infectious diseases like now, a situation of natural disaster, or a drastic decline in budgetary revenue. Those are the three main differences or amendments to the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. And you can see there that we withdrew money or funds in May, and the HSF recovered very nicely. We withdrew again in June, and again the HSF recovered very nicely just from the interest income of the fund. And then we withdrew again in August, and what I've been told last Friday is that the HSF is headed towards the 6 billion benchmark again. So that will take care of the raiding part. But one final thing is that I don't know, maybe the international capital markets and the money markets are working in our favor. Maybe it's the portfolio allocation. Maybe we have excellent asset managers. But ladies and gentlemen, this is the year 2020, and I'm taking any good news. So the recovery of the Heritage and Civilization Fund, good news. Next slide. And thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Finance, Mr. Vishnu Dan Paul. We're now going to have an overview of Budget 2021 and the economy from the Honorable Minister Colum Imbere in the Ministry of Finance. Mr. Imbere is a qualified civil engineer and registered engineer with 2 degrees in engineering and 2 postgraduate degrees in law. As of April 2020, he has served as an elected PNM Member of Parliament for over 28 continuous years and as a cabinet minister in 5 PNM governments for an aggregate cabinet experience of almost 18 years. For almost 40 years, Mr. Imbere has also been serving Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean region in his original profession of engineering. Professionally, Mr. Imbere is a member of the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators and the Energy Institute and registered with the Board of Engineering on Trinidad and Tobago. After leaving UWI in 1991 to pursue a career in politics, he expanded his knowledge base from engineering into law and taxation. In 2007, he attained a Master's of Law degree in construction law and arbitration with distinction. And in 2016, he attained his 3rd master's degree, this time in oil and gas law, again with distinction, with a specialization in fiscal regimes and oil taxation. Both of his specialized law degrees are from the Aberdeen Business School in Scotland. Ladies and gentlemen, the Honorable Minister of Finance, Mr. Colum Imbere.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Dr. the Honorable Keith Christopher Rowley, Prime Minister of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, my cabinet colleagues, other members of Parliament, the Chief Secretary of the Tobago House of Assembly, ambassadors and high commissioners, permanent secretaries, mayors of cities and boroughs, senior government officials, the media, and members of the viewing public in particular, as well as representatives of the private sector and business organizations and other NGOs. My presentation today will be twofold. I have a slide presentation and some commentary. And the intention of today's presentation is not to deliver the 2020 budget. That will happen next week, Monday. So that there are some things that I will say, and there are some things that I will not say. But the main point that needs to be made is our situation. So if you can go to the first slide, please. Now, if you look at this graph carefully, the red line at the top is oil prices. And you will see that oil prices up to 2018 had recovered strongly after a catastrophic fall in the 2014 to 2015 period. If you look in particular at the 2010 to 2014 period, you would see that oil prices were in the 90s. And in fact, in 2014, oil prices crossed 100. Those prices you are seeing are average prices. But then there was a terrible collapse starting in July 2014, right down to February 2016, when oil actually hit $26. We then had quite a strong recovery up to 2018, and then a collapse began again. You see at the end of the graph there is the average oil price for the year 2020 so far, which is $38. But as we all know, some months ago, oil did the unthinkable and went into negative territory. It went to zero and then went into negative territory. In fact, our local oil company, Heritage Petroleum, chose to store oil rather than attempt to sell it, because if they had sold it, if they could have, there was no demand whatsoever, they would have suffered a severe loss. The blue line is natural gas prices. And you can see they have dropped from an average of about $9 in 2008 down to the current 1.9. Next slide, please. This gives you an indication of three things. The red line is unemployment. And you can see that unemployment has been very stable for the last 12 to 13 years in the vicinity of 5%. And it remains so to this day. Up and down, little variations, but it's a relatively flat line. And the last estimate I had of unemployment was just below 5% or 4%. The blue line is our economic situation. The blue line is our gross domestic product. And if you look at 2009, you will see with the global collapse, financial crisis of 2009, you will see how our gross domestic product, our GDP growth rate dropped from 5%, where it was in 2007, into negative territory in 2009. Then recovered again as commodity prices recovered in 2009, 2010, and then sort of chugged along at a very low rate, close to zero, till again oil prices collapsed in 2016 and our GDP fell again. In 2016, this government took a number of decisions, made a number of changes to the way we do business. We reformed the energy taxation regime. We adjusted our taxation system. And as you can see, there began a recovery in 2016, and that is the blue line going up to 2018. In 2019, once again, commodity prices began to collapse, and then 2020 is COVID. So you see what has happened to us. But generally, we have not been doing very well, economically speaking, for the last several years. Can we go to the next slide, please? I just threw this in just to give you an idea that we don't only have problems with oil and gas prices. We have problems with petrochemicals. And I just pick one, ammonia. And you can see what has happened to ammonia, where in 2014, not too long ago, the price of ammonia per metric ton was over $600 US, close to 700. And it dropped to below $250 in December 2018. And our fortunes in the petrochemical sector are directly linked to the prices of the end product, the petrochemicals themselves. So this drastic collapse in petrochemical prices has not helped because it has exacerbated the situation that has occurred with oil and gas. Next slide, please. This gives you some idea of what happened to revenues from petroleum. Reaching a high in the 2014 period, that's a peak. These are four different things: supplementary petroleum tax, petroleum profits tax, there's a total, and the line at the bottom is royalties. So you can see in 2014, there's a significant collection of petroleum taxes in excess of $16 billion. And as you can see what happened in 2016, 2017, it virtually went down to zero. And then we began a recovery in 2017, going up to 2018, and again, COVID has damaged that recovery. Let's go to the next slide, please. This is oil and gas revenue. Again, it's a percentage of total revenue. If you look at the 2011 period, oil and gas revenue was in the 40s, 41%, 43% of total government revenue. Look at what happened in 2016, dropped to 7%. And then it began to climb again, and in 2018, 2019, we got it back up to 23%. So all of these slides will show you a precipitous decline from 2014 down to 2016, and then a recovery from 2016, 2017 into 2018. Next slide, please. If I take out oil and gas, and I look at the non-oil sector, you can see that we're actually doing quite well. The top line is taxes on incomes and profits. And there was a decline consistent with the collapse of commodity prices. But again, as you can see in the 2017, 2018, 2019 period, we were improving our revenue from incomes and profits, taxation, significantly, several $1 billion of increase. The middle line is value-added tax, which has been more or less consistent for many, many years. And the bottom line is customs duties, which again has been fairly consistent for the last 10 years or so. If we go now to the next slide, and this is a very important slide. The blue line is total revenue. I started this table in 2010, and it ends in 2020, so it's a 10-year span. The red line is expenditure. So you can see from the 2010 to 2014 period, expenditure was consistently increasing. This is government expenditure. From 46 billion in 2010 to virtually 63 billion in 2014. But revenue was not keeping pace with expenditure. Even though revenue was increasing, there was no plan at that time to balance the budget. So even though revenue increased from 43 billion in 2010 to 58 billion in 2014, and that's an increase of some $15 billion in annual revenue on a year-on-year basis, expenditure got out of control. If, on the other hand, expenditure had been contained, we would have had a balanced budget sometime in the period 2013 to 2014. 2015 marks the period that we came in. You see what happens to revenue. It drops from the $58 to $57 billion figure in the 2014-2015 period down to $36 billion in 2016-2017. So $20 billion falls out. Actually, $22 billion falls out of government revenue from the 2014-2015 period to the 2016-2017 period. And we therefore had no choice but to cut expenditure. We couldn't cut it to 36, and I'll talk about that in a little while. Mr. Danpol has already shown you that after paying salaries, senior citizens' pensions, government pensions, debt service, and other mandatory expenditure, social grants and so on, we have to spend $42 billion a year. That's before anything else. That's before our capital program. That is before goods and services to pay bills for supplies in ministries. We have to spend $42 billion a year, or $3.5 billion a month on average. So if we had cut our expenditure to match the revenue in 2017, something would have had to give. Pensions, social welfare, employment in the public service, something would have had to give. And this government made a conscious decision not to reduce the demand side of the economy to an extent where it would crash the entire economy, but we had no choice but to take expenditure down from the high of 63, and we got it down to 49 in 2018. The other two lines at the bottom there just give you some idea of what was happening with different types of revenue. The purple line at the bottom is energy sector revenue. And energy sector revenue was above non-energy revenue for the period 2010 to 2013. And then it collapses, the purple line at the bottom. And you see what happens to energy sector revenue. It drops from a total of approximately $27 to $26 billion. And energy sector revenue, not just revenue from petroleum, it's petrochemical sector, etc. It drops from 27 billion in 2011 down to 7 billion in 2016. $20 billion just disappears from the energy sector revenue. Whereas the non-energy sector was not so badly affected. It was affected. It had got up to 37 billion in the 2015-2016 period, but dropped down to 28 in 2017, and then started to recover as the economy recovered to $32 billion. So the non-energy side of the economy has not suffered as badly as the energy side. But the importance of this slide is the fact that expenditure kept outpacing revenue in those years when we had substantial revenues, the 2010 to 2014 period. And as I said, if there had been a plan at that time to balance the budget, we would not have been in the situation we are now. Can I go to the next slide, please? This is just illustrative, again excluding oil, and it shows the recovery in tax revenue in the non-oil sector in the 2016 to 2018 period. Again, next slide. Similarly, this shows you with the red line, that's income from oil companies. You see how it just disappears in the 2016-27 period. The green line is the total revenue, which is profoundly affected by the decline in oil revenue, and the blue line is the rest of the economy, which seemed to survive the collapse in energy prices in the 2016 to 2017 period. Next slide, please. Again, this is just an illustration of what was happening. On the right-hand side, in the 14-15 period, we had significant revenues dropping down to 2016-17 and then recovering in the 18 to 19 period. Our measures were working from around 2017 to 2019, and then COVID comes in 2020 and throws us down again. Next slide, and this is a very important slide as well. If you look at personnel expenditure, and this is simply in the public service, this is not taking into account statutory authorities, state enterprises, and so on. This is just the public service. In the 2007-2008 period, expenditure on salaries and wages in the public sector was in the region of $6.5 billion. Then a sharp increase from 2010 going up and eventually settling in 2015 at $10 billion. So that we went from a situation in 2009, 2010, just over $6.5 billion per year on salaries and wages in the public sector, to in a very short period, in just 4 years, we hit $10 billion. And very, very difficult to reduce that figure. Some of the peaks in the graphs are back pay. So if you smooth them out, you come to the levels at the end of the graph on the right-hand side. And that is a level somewhere in the $9 to $9.5 billion level, which is $3 billion more than what it was 10 years ago. Again, the next slide just gives you actual figures. These are just numbers giving you some understanding of what has happened with personnel expenditure. And you see personnel expenditure, because of back pay and other things, going from 6.9 in 2009 up to $10 billion 2015, 9.6 in 2016, and so on. Next slide, please. This is another difficult area of the economy. This gives you an understanding of how transfers and subsidies affect our expenditure profile. The red line is transfers and subsidies. And they reached a peak in 2014, and that would essentially be because of the fuel subsidy at the time. But notwithstanding all the efforts we have made to reduce transfers and subsidies so far, you see where they are in terms of total expenditure. They are still very, very significant. If you look at the last line, last two lines, 2019, 2020, you see that transfers and subsidies are more than half of total government expenditure. Next slide. Again, this gives you an idea of the recovery of the economy. The green and red lines, the green line is our current account balance. The yellow line is our overall balance. And if you look on the right-hand axis, you will see we were heading towards a current account balance in 2019. That's the green line. We had almost reached a current account balance from a significant current account deficit in the 2016 to 2017 period because of the collapse of oil and gas prices. Again, on the right-hand side, COVID hits us again. So we had a current account deficit or overall deficit in 2016, 2017 down in the $13 billion region, getting it into balance by 2019 and then back down again, as Vishnu has pointed out to you. We have a deficit somewhere in the vicinity of $17 billion this year. So COVID has really damaged our economy, and we are not unique in that respect. I'll talk about that in a little while. Next slide, please. This gives you an idea of what was happening with state enterprises. And this is withdrawals in terms of extraordinary dividends from state enterprises such as the National Gas Company. If you look in the period 2013 to 2015, you see we hit a peak in 2015 where the government of the day withdrew from state enterprises extraordinary dividends in the region of $10 billion. We no longer have those luxuries. If you go right down to the end, we'll be lucky if, in terms of capital revenue and profits from state enterprises, if there are any at all, to get $1 billion this year. Whereas in 2015, the government of the day was lucky to get $10 billion in dividends from the state enterprise sector. Next slide, Heritage and Stabilization Fund. And this will contextualize what Vishnu was talking about. If we start over on the right, on the left, sorry, the dates on this are not accurate on this slide. I will fix that. But the date on the far left is 2015, sorry. So when we came in September 2015, the balance in the fund was $5.5 billion US. Now, in September 2020, exactly 5 years later, the balance in the fund is $5.8 billion. So that over the period September 2015, as I said, I have to fix the axis on the slide, from September 2015 to September 2020, despite significant withdrawals, we have withdrawn in excess of $1.5 billion US over the period September 2015 to September 2020. The Heritage and Stabilization Fund is still higher than it was in September 2015. And what that demonstrates to you is, despite withdrawals totaling $1.5 billion, $900 million US in this year, 600 in the previous 4 years aggregate, the Heritage and Stabilization Fund improved by $1.8 billion US over that period, which is why there's a net increase of some $300 million US over the last 5 years. So this puts paid to the old talk about we have raided the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. I don't know how that language can apply when the fund is now $300 million US higher than it was 5 years ago. Let's go to the next slide. This is reserves. Again, when we came in, there was a lot of talk about our foreign reserves. We were told by experts that if we did not devalue the dollar 10 to 1, immediately, our reserves would evaporate in less than 1 year. Well, we have made the entire 5 years, and we still have the blue shaded area is our reserves. And we still have foreign reserves in excess of $7 billion US. And we have import cover of 8.7 months. As you can see, there has been a significant improvement in our gross official foreign reserves position and our import cover position since 2018. We stabilized the decline in foreign reserves, and we stabilized the decline in import cover, and our reserves have in fact grown over the last year or two, and our import cover has grown now almost 9 months. Next slide. This is what we've had to do. Our debt to GDP ratio, we've had to borrow, we've had no choice in order to maintain the demand side of the economy. And we project by the end of this year, our debt to GDP ratio will be in the vicinity of 77%, up from 65%. And that is all to do with what has happened during this COVID-19 period, during this last 6 months. We've had to do a combination of withdrawals from the Heritage and Stabilization Fund and borrowing. Now, I want to use one of the slides that Vishnu had. Next slide, please. I'll do some arithmetic for you. If you look at mandatory expenditure, let's take the month of April. That's a good month as an indicator. And you add pensions and gratuities, which is in the first section, and you add to that social grants, you get a figure of almost $750 million a month. So currently, the government is obligated to pay government pensioners, pay gratuities to government officers, pay senior citizens their pensions, pay social welfare recipients their public assistance, their disability assistance, their food cards, conditional cash transfers, and so on, somewhere in the vicinity of $750 a month. That works out at $9 billion per year. Just social grants alone, as you look at this graph, is virtually $500 million a month. $6 billion a year. Then when you look at salaries, start at the top, 97 million direct charges, then appropriated funds, another 635 million, then current transfers and subsidies, 514 million, then statutory boards, 229 million, and I haven't added in the salary component of the Tobago House of Assembly, but just adding what I just called there, the salary components in direct charges, appropriated funds, transfers and subsidies, statutory boards, our salary bill, not including House of Assembly, is $1.5 billion a month. And in fact, when you add it all together, what budgets have told me is that it's close to $1.7 billion per month. If you do the maths, you're talking $20 billion. So the public service, direct public service, is somewhere $9 billion or so. The rest of the people that we look after and make sure they get salaries every month is another $11 billion. So you're talking $20 billion a year in salaries and wages in the public sector and the state enterprise sector. And that is why, if you go to the next slide, we struggle every month with what we call discretionary expenditure. Because if you take the 3.5 for mandatory and $1 billion for discretionary, we struggle along at $4.5 billion a month, which takes us to somewhere in the vicinity of $50 billion a year. And we simply have to try to do our best in terms of goods and services and in terms of our capital program. Let me now go to my narrative. I have one more slide, but I'll keep it for later. Now, I just want to summarize. In terms of revenue, the country hit a high in terms of revenue in 2014 of $58.4 billion. At that time, oil was $100 a barrel, and LNG prices were as much as 4 times what they are now, depending on the destination of the gas. That revenue of $58 billion included billions of dollars in dividends from the national gas company. 2 years later, revenue had dropped from 58 billion to 36 billion, a decline of 22 billion, or 38%. We were able to use a number of innovative measures to grow that revenue, that $36 billion revenue in 2016, up to 46 in 2018, 2019. So we were on track to get it up to a figure of 50 billion, which would have balanced our budget. In terms of expenditure also hit a high in 2014, $63 billion. And that was due in no small measure to a $2 billion annual increase in public sector wages just before the 2015 election. There was also massive spending on capital projects at very high prices during that 2013, 2014, 2015 period. Again, that 63 billion just simply could not be sustained. This government was able to cut expenditure by $10 billion, actually closer to 12. We cut expenditure by over 20%. And it's important that you understand that even though we cut expenditure from 63 in 2014 to 49 in 2018, which is a 22% decrease, there was no wage loss. There were no wage losses in the public sector, no wage cuts in the public sector, no significant reduction in government services, no significant reduction in social welfare, social grants, pensions. In fact, we increased in some instances. For example, we increased the cap on pensions so that persons who are both beneficiaries of NIS and senior citizens pension could get more relief. So there was no reduction in employment in the public sector, no reduction in wages in the public sector, no reduction in government services. In fact, there were increases in terms of social grants. And yet, we were still able to cut expenditure by $13 billion. And that is something people need to think about. And that is a question that should have been in your presentation, Vishnu. What was that $13 billion being spent on? Because if no job losses, no salary cuts, no reduction in government services, increases in social welfare, and we still were able to spend $13 billion less, it begs the question, what was that being spent on? I've already spoken about the fact that our mandatory or inescapable expenditure every month is $3.5 billion, or $42 billion a year. And if you dissect that, as I said, $18 to $20 billion on salary and wage payments across the public service and the state sector, $750 million a month, or $9 billion a year on government pensions, senior citizens pension, social grants, and $500 million per month, or $6 billion per year, is spent on direct subsidies. And the subsidies I'm talking about, we spend $2.5 billion per year subsidizing WASA. Last year, we took out a loan for $100 million US, 700 million TT, to pay for desalinated water, because WASA had not been paying its bills to DesalCorp. And we had to borrow $700 million. So when you add up the monthly subvention to WASA, that $700 million for desalinated water, and other debt that we incurred for WASA, you're talking $2.5 billion subsidizing WASA in the last year or so. We spend over $500 million per year subsidizing TNTech. People don't know this. TNTech does not pay the National Gas Company for gas. It simply does not pay, and has not paid for years. And it says it can't pay. That when it looks at its revenue from electricity bills and so on, and it looks at its expenditure, it can't pay for gas. It does not pay. So the government was required to enter into an arrangement to borrow in excess of $5 billion so that we could give that money to the National Gas Company. Otherwise, National Gas Company would collapse because they're carrying that on their books all the time as income, but they're not getting it. So we had to resolve that. We also spent billions of dollars on fuel subsidies, bus transportation, chronic disease medication, the ferry service, the air bridge, and so on. Quite apart from all of that, COVID-19 has already cost us $4 billion in 2020, and our final estimates are closer to $5 billion. So that one thing I will say is that we have to look at these things. We have to look at the fact that we subsidize WASA to the tune of over $2 billion a year. We subsidize TNTech to over $500 million a year. We spend over $500 million per year on GATE. And then we have billions of dollars per year on other subsidies, which I've just mentioned. But in all of this, there is good news. And I'll take this opportunity now to talk about our credit rating and ability to borrow. This was drawn to my attention yesterday that some commentators say, you know, that we have junk bond status, we can't borrow, you know, we can't go to the capital markets and so on. And I just want to remind the general public that this government had two very successful international financing initiatives. Two. In 2016, and that was when oil was $26, oil had collapsed. We went to the market in the United States, and we were able to raise $1 billion US. Our offer was oversubscribed by almost 200% within 3 hours of launching. And we were able to get $1 billion US at 4.5% over 10 years, one of the best interest rates this government has got in the last 15 or 20 years. And just 3 months ago in June, at the height of COVID, with borders closed, countries locked down all over the world, economies collapsing everywhere, oil and gas prices going to zero, we raised another US $500 million in the United States, oversubscribed again by almost 200% in just 3 hours, and again at a very excellent interest rate of 4.5% over 10 years. So if our credit rating was nonsense, if we were an international pariah, and if the rest of the world felt that this government can't manage this economy, then how on earth did the international banks and international financing institutions in 2016 and 2019 lend us a total of $1.5 billion US at 4.5%? And we did it in 2 to 3 hours, launching on Bloomberg at 8 o'clock in the morning, and by 11 o'clock you have offers of $2 and $3 billion US. So that is what the outside world thinks of us. They think we are very good managers. I've spoken to you about our Heritage and Stabilization Fund. It is still $300 million US, higher than it was in 2015. Our reserves, over $7 billion US, and we have over 8 months of import cover. We continue to believe that no useful purpose will be served by devaluation, especially at this time, when US dollar inflows are extremely low, and they are extremely low as a result of COVID-19, because they have depressed oil and gas prices, and they have depressed oil and gas production. And therefore, the inflows that we were getting in 2018 and 2019 are now significantly less. So if you devalue, what happens? You convert your US dollars to TT dollars at a higher rate. You get more TT dollars. But if you're getting minimal inflows of US dollars, it's insufficient to counteract the effects of devaluation, which are increased cost of raw materials for your manufacturing sector, increased cost of food imports, wage demands from trade unions who would quite naturally want to get a wage increase because the cost of living will go up, Your international debt servicing will go up because your foreign debt is in US dollars. And in fact, I asked the central bank to model this for me over the last 2 weeks. What will be the effect, the net effect of a devaluation of the TT dollar? And the increase in government revenue is minimal. Minimal. You're talking less than 100 million US dollars. 30, 40 million US dollars is the numbers I saw. But inflation will go from 1% to 6% or 7% immediately, and the standard of living in Trinidad and Tobago would decline immediately. So we continue at this time, now that foreign inflows are very low, to believe that devaluation is not the answer at this time. What I want to end with now is the world. Can I go to the last slide, please? Take a look at this. This is an international study I came across this morning. These are the preliminary estimates of the effect of COVID-19 on European economies. We'll start with Greece. You're looking at a contraction of 9.7%. Italy, minus 9.5%. Spain, minus 9.4%. UK, minus 8.3%. France, minus 8.2%, and so on. These are the preliminary estimates of the effect of COVID-19 on just European economies in 2020. So we are not unique. And I would like the persons who comment on our economy to concede and recognize that Trinidad and Tobago is not unique. And we have, in fact, managed our situation far better than many other countries. The Congressional Budget Office in the United States estimates that the unemployment rate in the U.S. increased from 3.5% in February to 14.7% in April of this year, representing a decline of more than 25 million people employed. 25 million people in the United States became unemployed between February and April of this year. 8 million exited the labor force. They stopped counting them. So if you added them as well, over 30 million persons left the labor force in the United States between February and April of this year. The federal budget deficit in the USA in fiscal year 2020 is estimated by the Congressional Budget Office to be $3.3 trillion US dollars, or 16% of GDP. So it is estimated that the budget deficit in the United States in 2020 will be 16% of GDP, versus their estimate at the beginning of the year, pre-COVID, of a $1 trillion deficit, one-third of what they expect it to be now, just over 4% of GDP. So they've gone from a budget deficit of 4% of GDP to a budget deficit of 16% of GDP. It's the largest annual budget deficit in the United States since the Second World War in 1945. In fact, they say it's the biggest blow to the U.S. economy since the Great Depression of 1929. Latest estimates indicate that GDP in the United States has fallen this year at an annualized rate of 33%. I didn't leave out a decimal point there. I didn't say 3.3. They expect the United States GDP to fall by 33% in 2020. It's the deepest decline since records began to be taken in the United States in 1947. There were 30 million Americans receiving unemployment relief in July 2020. In the United Kingdom, the British government borrowed over twice as much in the 3-month period May to June 2020 than it did in the whole of 2019. So in 3 months, it borrowed twice as much than it borrowed in 12 months in the previous year. The budget deficit stands now at 35 billion pounds, or 45 billion US dollars. Borrowing in the first 3 months of this fiscal year in the UK has gone to a record 128 billion pounds. That would be 10 times Trinidad and Tobago. Debt in the UK has climbed to 99.6% of GDP. And these are figures from last month, so it may be more now. The highest since 1961. The budget deficit in the UK for 2020, that was originally forecast to be just 55 billion pounds, is now on course to reach 400 million pounds, according to the Office for Budget Responsibility in the UK. In India, it is estimated that India's economy contracted by a staggering 45% for the period May to June 2020. Some countries are on the verge of economic collapse. Dubai is on the brink. It is expected that 70% of Dubai businesses will go out of business within the next 6 months. In the United Arab Emirates, businesses are slashing salaries, putting employees on unpaid leave, and retrenching employees. The state-owned airline, Emirates Airlines, recently fired 600 pilots, which is one of the largest layoffs in aviation history. The airline also announced a 50% salary cut for employees. The World Bank estimates the global economy will shrink by 5.2% this year, representing the deepest recession since the Second World War, with the largest declines in per capita output since 1870. So I tell you all of this because we in Trinidad and Tobago have done much better than this. Much, much better than this. When you think about India's economy contracting by 45%, United States economy are contracting by 33%, we in Trinidad and Tobago have done a much better job than these advanced economies. But, as the Prime Minister pointed out, we have decisions to make. We have inescapable expenditure of $42 billion every year, and we have subsidies in terms of subsidizing of WASA, of TNTEC, and other subsidies that I would say somewhere in the vicinity of $10 billion a year. We don't see it at all possible that we can cut pensions or any of the nightmare scenarios that are out there being promoted by those who just want to create trouble. That's not going to happen. We can't do that. We can't cut pensions. We can't cut social welfare benefits and so on. We have no plans at this point in time to retrench anybody in the public service. But we have to understand our situation. With the best will in the world, I don't see revenue crossing $40 billion in 2021. I was giving a little peek into the budget of 2021. With the best mechanism and the best will in the world, I don't see it crossing $40 billion. And as I've indicated before, to maintain the demand side of the economy, and that's Keynesian economics, that you need to spend to fuel economic growth. If you contract too much, you just crash the entire economy. So we have serious decisions to make. What level of expenditure would the government be required or can make in 2021? And where are we going to look at areas where we have to make savings? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister of Finance, Colum Imbere. Now, just maybe you're now tuning in, we would like to welcome you. You're in tune to the Ministry of Finance Spotlight on the Budget and Economy in 2021. At this time, we're going to take a very short intermission, only 15 minutes, and when we resume, we're going to commence our panel discussion with our specially invited industry leaders. And in that forum, some of you will have an opportunity to pose your questions to the distinguished panel. So we're going to take that short intermission, and we'll be back. The panel will consist of the Honorable Minister of Finance, Colum Imbere, the President of the Bankers Association of Trinidad and Tobago, Karen Darbesi, President of the National Gas Company, Mr. Mark Loquan, Business Executive, Christian Mouteh, and Professor Jerry Brooks, co-chair of the Roadmap to Recovery Committee. So these individuals will be a part of our panel discussion when we resume on Spotlight on the Budget and Economy 2021. Thank you. Have been introduced, Mr. Vishnu Dan Paul. We have the Honorable Minister of Finance, Colum Imbere. We also have Ms. Karen Darbesi. She's the President of the Bankers Association of Trinidad and Tobago. And Ms. Darbesi is the Group Chief Executive Officer of First Citizens. She assumed the role of GCEO in April 2015. As GCEO, she's focused on creating, planning, implementing, and integrating the strategic direction of the group. Ms. Darbesi services as a director on several subsidiary boards within the First Citizens Group. She's a former director of the board of the American Chamber of Commerce of Trinidad and Tobago, ANCHAM, and St. Lucia Electricity Services Limited. She currently serves as a member of the board of directors of the Energy Chamber of Trinidad and Tobago, chairman of Trinidad Nitrogen Company Limited, and president of the Bankers Association of Trinidad and Tobago, Ms. Karen Darbesi. And next we have the president of the National Gas Company, Mr. Mark Edward Loquan. Mr. Loquan is a chemical engineer with over 30 years' experience in the petrochemical industry. He was appointed president of NGC in 2016 and director on the board in July of 2019. Since in 2016, at the helm of NGC, Mr. Loquan has led a process of restructuring and transforming NGC, expanding and diversifying the business portfolio, accelerating the use of technology, and strengthening the company's presence in the value chain. With a keen focus on sustainability, he is instrumental in contract negotiations, positioning NGC as an integrated energy player at a most uncertain and volatile period in the global and local industry. Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the National Gas Company of Trinidad and Tobago, Mr. Mark Edward Loquan. We also have a part of the panel, Business Executive, Mr. Christian Mouteh. Mr. Mouteh is a business person. He occupies the position of Chairman of Prestige Holdings Limited, Chairman of Angostinis Limited, also Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Victor E. Mouteh Limited. In the past, Mr. Christian Mouteh occupied the position of Chairman at Telecommunications Services of Trinidad and Tobago Limited and President of Trinidad and Tobago Chamber and Industry and Commerce. He's also the Chairman of CDA and Director of Republic Bank. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Christian Mouteh. And finally, part of our distinguished industry leaders today, we have the co-chair of the Roadmap to Recovery Committee, Professor Jerry Brooks. An energetic game changer, Professor Brooks is the chairman of the Unit Trust Corporation and brings a wealth of regional and hemispheric experience across a diverse range of sectors, including financial services, oil and gas, and manufacturing. He also currently chairs ADR Services and B&B Limited. An attorney at law, Professor Brooks holds an MBA from Columbia University Dean's Honor Roll and also graduated from the Hugh Wooding Law School and the University of the West Indies. He served as the Vice President of the Law Association of Trinidad and Tobago for 4 consecutive terms unopposed and served as Deputy Chairman of the Caribbean Court of Justice Trust Fund for 10 years. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Professor Jerry Brooks. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen, our distinguished industry leaders, and their focus here today is to give us some insight, their recommendations, their views on what was discussed and shared today by the Honorable Minister of Finance. And we're going to start with Group Chief Executive Officer, Ms. Karen Darbesi, to give her thoughts on what was shared today. Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together as we hear from Ms. Karen Darbesi.
Honorable Prime Minister, members of the Cabinet of the Government of Trinidad and Tobago, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, all other protocols observed, good morning. Thank you, Minister, for inviting all of us here at this to listen this morning to the information that was so eloquently put forward. I think in listening to what both yourself and Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Finance articulated, it's clear to us that Trinidad and Tobago went into a COVID-19 pandemic with buffers that not many of our counterparts would have had the benefit of, and thus far, based on the information that you shared this morning, the buffers have been preserved to the extent that we could have preserved them while still working towards the support that we needed to provide to the national economy in the midst of this crisis. When I review all of the information that is available from global sources, it is clear, as you have positioned, that we have not fared as badly as some. We have been able to make a reasonably measured approach to our response to COVID. But what is also clear to me in a global context is that the global ability to recover from this pandemic and from the impact it has had on the global economy is not an immediate recovery. We are into a dealing with an economic recovery from COVID-19 for an extended period of time. I have seen some estimates go out as well in excess of 5 years. Some of the key points that came out to me from your presentation this morning: our Heritage and Stabilization Fund still at very reasoned levels, providing us a buffer, just under $6 billion. Our net international reserves still up at $7.4 billion and over 8 months of import cover. Of concern, Minister, the debt to GDP ratio rising. And one concern for me personally, and I do think that in a crisis, a key parameter is to access the resources that you need to access in order to survive the crisis. And international borrowing was, or borrowing on the external market, was a very critical factor in looking at one ratio which was not highlighted this morning, which is showing an uptick, which is our external debt as the percentage of the total debt. While this country has had, for many years, an external debt to GDP ratio that is in the very low double-digit range, we are starting to see an uptick of that external debt to GDP ratio, and I believe the number is hovering below 20%, still at a relatively healthy level, but a parameter that we need to keep watch of, because the very positive borrowing terms that we were able to access, as you mentioned, in June, in the midst of COVID, being able to access what is, in principle, the identical terms and conditions as what you were able to access in 2016, speaks volumes to, as you rightly said, how our international creditors view this country. But in a situation where net international reserves still at healthy levels but trending down, an external debt to GDP ratio that's trending up is a trend that we need to keep our eyes on. I was very pleased to, and I'm looking for my notes that I made on the Minister of Finance statement, no useful purpose to be served by devaluation in the current environment. From a business perspective, businesses, in order to make reasoned judgments on investments and investments for growth, the Prime Minister indicated this morning that, and I'm going to paraphrase you, Prime Minister, that while we have to focus in the short term on survival, we also have to focus as a country on doing things that we would not normally do and no longer postponing decisions that we should be making. We need to be positioning the economy for growth in the medium term. And I think a very solid statement to give certainty and to engender confidence in the business community is your statement, no useful purpose to be served by devaluation. As representing the financial services sector this morning, I would say another very important parameter for outlook from a business perspective is the interest rate environment and the coordination of fiscal policy, which is what you will be addressing in the budget, alongside the monetary policy, and making sure that both fiscal and monetary policy work hand in hand to engender an environment that is suitable for investment is one that we must, as a country, keep our eyes on. In looking at you will be thankful to know, Minister, that I am not going to speak about asking for any additional expenditure for the financial services sector, but in focusing on the medium-term position and guided very much by the work that I took part in as a member of the Roadmap Committee, and speaking as to some of the measures that the financial services sector, not just the banks, the entire sector, looked at, some points for consideration, which is more on a policy position and looking at the short-term budget as the one-year budgetary cycle very much as an operational budget, but positioning in that within a medium-term strategic outlook for the country. Some of the very important policy considerations that we'd like to put on the table from the credit union sector, Minister. In your budget statement last year, we spoke about oversight body for the credit union. I think it was clear in the pandemic the role that the credit union and the financial cooperative sector plays for the transmission of fiscal policy into their target market base, which is a base that is very much embedded in small and micro enterprises. The role of the credit union sector can be enhanced, as I think you pointed out, but COVID overtook, and the ability to operationalize on the measure you stated in the budget, which is allow the credit unions a wider depth of product availability for their membership, is something that needs to be brought to the table for a medium-term philosophy. I think even within the midst of the crisis, the credit union sector, and you recognize this by implementing the credit union loan support program, the mechanism using the credit union sector for transmission of that fiscal policy through to the micro enterprises and the small enterprises is one that we cannot miss in ensuring that we leave no one behind. From a fintech association, from a fintech grouping, I did note that in the midst of COVID, in August, the e-money order was released, which from a government perspective provides very much an umbrella around giving guidance from a policy perspective and from an operational perspective with respect to fintechs, registration, and more of a bringing the fintechs into the formal part of the financial services sector. That was a very welcome first step. But I think, Minister, the articulation of the government philosophy very clearly on digital payments and collections as we start to move this economy into a more efficient one, improve the ease of doing business, and driving the digital agenda is one that we very much look forward in your budget statement, as well as to the new digital transformation ministry that Minister West is overseeing, to understand how the payment system and government, as you rightly said, being a significant player in the system, how the demand drivers from government payments and government collections can be used to facilitate the growth of an industry that can aid in the ease of doing business for us as a country. I think on that basis, I noticed, Minister, that there was not a whole lot of mention in your transfer and subsidies on the National Insurance Board. As a member of the financial system, we do need to place some increased emphasis on the National Insurance Board and that issue that we face as a country with a deficit that is there, and the policy positions around closing that deficit, not necessarily through funding only, but from policy amendments as far as our social security system. And I think from a banking perspective, really as the banks drive towards increased digitization in the economy, the legislative agenda that needs to be addressed has to come to the fore. We have several acts, several pieces of legislation that are partially proclaimed, and that as we move towards improving the ease of doing business, we need to focus on the Electronic Transfers Act, the Data Protection. There are many, the Transfer of Funds Act and Bills of Exchange Act. Those pieces of legislation need to be aligned as we move forward as a country to really move towards the medium-term vision that we want to be able to move this country towards. So I'll leave it at that as a kickoff. I think from the financial services sector as a whole, we see the sector having a role to play, and the role to play very much being aligned with the retooling of our economy to make ourselves more efficient and to make the ease of doing business more evident. I will leave it at that at this point in time and hand over back to the facilitator.
Thank you so very much, Ms. Karen Darbesi, representing the financial sector, President of the Bankers Association of Trinidad and Tobago. Now we're going to have some comments in my point of view in representing the energy sector, the President of the National Gas Company, Mr. Mark Loquan.
Thank you. Good morning, all. Dr. the Honorable Prime Minister, Dr. Keith Christopher Rowley, the Honorable Minister of Finance, Colin Mimbert, all protocols observed, members of the media. Thank you for inviting us and giving us a deep insight in terms of where we are financially. I think that is a true, stark reality. In the world of energy, I think I should split up my 5 minutes into 3 areas. One is, what was going on before? And it's not just what, but why. And then secondly, what did COVID do? And thirdly, what can we expect after that? So if you look at the energy world, you would see, of course, the shale gas revolution changed a lot of things. It changed a lot of things from the point of LNG exports. It changed it in terms of the gas prices in the States and new plants being built. And I would say over the last years, it has been a period of just trying to stabilize the gas contractual situation, the stability on supply and developments, and of course all the legal issues that were going on in the background. If you look and see what happened in 2018 to 2019, as you would have indicated, the ammonia prices dropped, 23% from 2018 to 19. Methanol dropped 31% from 2018 to 19. If you look at 2020, it's 10% further in ammonia, and it's another 27% further in methanol. And if you look at the LNG part of the equation, you would see that a lot of supply came online prior to COVID. And that also resulted in surplus and will result in a surplus for some years to come. And how Trinidad positions in this energy world is quite an important factor. So while all of this is going on, of course, you have the whole climate change issue. And if you're in the energy world, most countries now and industries and companies are saying, well, if you do business as usual with the policies that are in place, CO2 emissions continue to rise and will reach about 3.5 degrees compared to the desired 2 degrees change. If you looked at BP's outlook on energy from last year to this year, you would see that they talked about peak oil in 2035. If you look at the outlook this year, you're already talking peak oil now. And you're talking going through different stages. So oil is at a percentage, let me make sure I don't quote the wrong figures, but oil is about 33% of the energy mix now in the world. If you look at the business as usual scenario where you don't do a thing, you just follow the normal policies, that goes to 24%, right? By 2050. If you start to talk the language of the BPs and Shells now, where you move to a carbon neutral world, means zero emissions, zero net emissions, then oil you're talking about as a percentage of that global value of 7%. Now that's simply what I'm quoting, and you see the changes from year to year actually taking place faster than you think. If you look at the renewables world, right now it's growing tremendously, but it's just 5% of the energy mix. And if you follow the sort of net zero emissions, it's getting to about 60% by 2050, if you achieve that net emission world. Business as usual is going to go up to about 22%. So what you see happening now as we reach into the COVID era now, the industrial demand has certainly shut off or been dramatically impacted because the ammonia and methanol products that are now competing with US product that has grown over the last years has to go further away. And those products go into making acrylonitrile, caprolactam on the ammonia side. I'm not counting fertilizer and food now. And on the methanol side, it's going into the acetic acid formaldehyde. But all of those are going into industries that are feeding the automotive, appliances, electronics industries. So will this recover? The answer to that is yes. But if you look at all the predictions, it looks quite difficult to do so because it's largely linked to the economies recovering. So it ranges from, as Karen says, if this was just it hit us once and then it recovers, you're talking like a 12 months until end of next year, where you are still seeing these kinds of, until the recovery comes along. And that depends on whether you have these multiple sort of COVID scenarios or not. So the bottom line is when you look at the post-COVID world, you have to prepare yourself now, not only with how we have been doing things, but I think now is the opportunity to also position the energy sector. It's a difficult 12 months, at least a year or two, as we know. And I know there's a lot of work going on across the whole value chain on that. So it's going to be important to, of course, continue the value chain work with gas strategies, which is led by the Ministry of Energy. It's also going to be important in this market-driven world, where it's no longer a case where whatever you produce, the market takes it. No, this is a case where the most competitive survives. This is a case where efficiency matters. So, yes, we've built up an industry that has been, it's a series of ranges of efficiency of plants and ages. But as you look forward, you would see in this market-driven world, the most efficient will have to find ways to survive, and the less efficient has to find ways to become more efficient. That's worldwide. We are not alone in the case of plants affected in Trinidad. You see on the ammonia side, you see in Egypt, in Qatar, in Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, Malaysia, plants have also been idled and reduced rates. In the case of methanol, you see Netherlands and Chile and China and so on also reducing rates. So we are in the global scenario where the industrial demand has been greatly impacted. We have to try and survive over this period, find solutions if we can. And for the longer term, the value chain work will yield, hopefully, some guidance for government in terms of what do you change in policy, incentives, and so on. That's an important piece of work. On the LNG side, the unitization of Atlantic is also important. How do you simplify the commercial arrangements? They become a world-class Atlantic facility. That's also an important issue when you start to recover out of this. And on the whole green agenda, I think now is the opportunity where we really look at the good examples that exist outside of Trinidad and look at the good examples that exist here, where we have the basis to get the full holistic view on energy efficiency, on all those renewables. And I guess my message is, whatever you think it's going to be, it's actually a lot faster it's happening. And how do you position ourselves and the country in the Caribbean region, where we see the susceptibility of hurricane seasons and the impacts on even our own situation in floods and agriculture and so on, and how do we actually use technology to look at all of these issues. I mean, we're using technology now on methane leaks, and can we use that technology on water leaks, and can we now look at the mapping of land and so on, and that world is changing very quickly too. So part of my message here is, if we have to survive this tough period and go forward, is also positioning yourself technologically and for the green space which will create jobs, which will create industrial services to the Caribbean region as well, that is moving away from fossil fuels and Petrocarib and so on. So I think we have an opportunity if we manage it well. So that's just a broad nutshell, I would say, for the 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mark Loquan, President of the National Gas Company. At this time, we will have some comments from Business Executive, Mr. Christian Muti.
That's the order.
Prime Minister, good morning, Prime Minister, Minister of Finance, other honorable ministers, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I have a few points I wanted to raise this morning with regards to the presentation from the Minister of Finance, and also some points coming out of the Roadmap to Recovery Committee. So the Prime Minister spoke this morning about priorities for the national economy and how resources are allocated, and touched on some critical areas that cannot be compromised: security, health, taking care of the most vulnerable in our society. And I wanted to, as far as being more specific to the economy, touch on some of the areas that I thought were also of priority. And really dealing with two key things that featured very significantly in the deliberations of the Roadmap to Recovery Committee. The first one, I would say, is I term living beyond our means. It has been clear to most people for some time that we in Trinidad and Tobago have been living beyond our means. We've run budget deficits for, I think, more than 10 years now. I think the minister showed. And clearly, continuing to run deficits is not sustainable. You can't deficit spend or borrow your way to prosperity. You can do it for periods of time when revenues have fallen and you need to bridge a period in time. But certainly economies like ours, which are susceptible to the movement of international prices of commodities, cannot continuously deficit spend. There have to be periods where we can meet our revenue, can meet expenditure, and we can pay down debt for periods of time, and then, if necessary, borrow once again. It's clear from what we've seen that, and I think both the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance touched on this, that we have to adjust our standard of living to a new reality, at least until such time as we're able to broaden and strengthen our economic base. We just can't continue to live beyond our means. Most critically also, we must address the drain on our foreign exchange. And this requires hard decisions on the things that we import. Again, maybe at least for a time, until we're better able to produce more of what we can eat and develop other sources of income outside of energy. The Minister of Finance made a clear statement this morning that at least for now, devaluation is on the table. And at least for now, we may be in a fortunate enough position that we can take that position. But if devaluation is not on the table, and we're also in a position where we can't continue to have a drain on foreign exchange, it means that other hard decisions have to be made. We can't continue to import all of the things at the same rate that we import now. We have to be able to curb our appetite for imported goods, Of course, the easiest way to do that is through pricing. If you take devaluation off the table, it means there have to be other mechanisms for pricing that will allow us to reduce our appetite for imported products. But there's no doubt that we can no longer continue to consume at the same rate. We simply don't earn the same amount of foreign exchange as we did in the past. The minister also touched on subsidies. And again, this is another area when you consider, and the minister presented some of the numbers this morning, but even if you assume income for the coming fiscal year at $40 billion, WASA alone is 5% of what we expect to earn in 2021, if we can earn $40 billion, which the minister said it would be optimistic. WASA alone could be over 5% of what we spend. And then when you put TNTech and some of the others inside of there, it gives you a sense of that the situation is not sustainable at that current level of drain. By the same token, we recognize that all the measures that we would like to take can't be taken at the same time because we would simply crash the economy. But I think the Prime Minister alluded to the fact that there must be a plan. We have to figure out what are the things we can do this year, next year, and the year after, so we could wean ourselves off of this dependency that we've had. On the area of living beyond our means, I'd just like to touch on one last point, which is the question of diversification. A word so much used, and I think we've all experienced over the years because it's not new. It's easier said than done. And I think one of the things we have to accept is that there's no silver bullet that's going to come along and replace the significant revenue that energy has represented to this country over the years. It's simply, that simply is not going to happen. Energy certainly will continue to be a part of our future for a long time. But in thinking and planning for diversification, it is more likely to be a combination of activities that together will provide a broader economic base. But what is for sure is that we will not stumble upon this. It will only happen if there is a clear plan, and more importantly, the will and ability to execute on that plan. Much good work has gone into the Roadmap to Recovery plan, which provides a framework for doing just that. But like everything else in life, it's going to come down to execution. Plan is wonderful, but we've got to get to the stage of execution. And so many times in the past, we've had wonderful plans, but have fallen down on the execution. And that takes me to my second point, ease of doing business. Execution of any economic plan is going to require an environment that's conducive to doing business. Trinidad and Tobago is a difficult place to do business. Our own experience and numerous reports and studies have confirmed this. Central to the success and transformation of any economy is an environment that is conducive to doing business. Businesses in Trinidad and Tobago face extreme difficulties at times in dealing with many institutions, including Town and Country, EMA, state lands, customs, and the port, to name a few. And this is not a new phenomenon. It has been like this for countless years and has continued to frustrate business, foreign investment, and business activity. And our problems don't just exist in the public sector. In the same report that places us so low in the ease of doing business, rates us third to last in the world in labor relations. Third to last. This too has to change if we are to have a vibrant and progressive economy. I also recognize that the private sector has a significant role to play. in the transformation of our economy. Years of excess and ample foreign exchange have led to some extent to risk aversion and underinvestment. While it can be argued that some of this is related to the ease of doing business, this too must change, if for no other reason but necessity, and we must regain our entrepreneurial drive. For my final contribution, I would just say, want to address a positive way forward. We fortunately remain masters of our own fate and future. While we can quite rightly lament the waste that took place in the past, it is the decisions and actions that we take now that will determine our future. Our current financial position, though difficult, is not desperate, and I think the Minister clearly demonstrated that. There's an abundance of talent and know-how in the public and private sectors. And I think from today's presentation and what we've been hearing and seeing over the last weeks and months, there's a broad acceptance that our circumstances have changed, and that by necessity requires difficult decisions now so that we can prosper in the future. Much good work has been done by the Roadmap Committee with participation from many sectors, including government, the public sector, labor, and the private sector, and many others. There's a clear willingness to make the necessary changes. What is required now is execution. When all else is done, the success to every plan comes down to execution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Christian Mote, Business Executive. We will now have some comments from co-chair of the Roadmap to Recovery Committee. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Jerry Brooks.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning. I will address briefly at a high level the Roadmap to Recovery report and just make one or two other comments. Honorable Prime Minister, Honorable Minister of Finance, Permanent Secretary, all other protocols observed. Our Phase 1 report focused on surviving the crisis, ensuring social stability, and reigniting the economy. Our Phase 2 report really focuses on pointing the economy in a new direction, reimagining the economy and not going back to where we were, but taking the country forward and taking the economy forward. It recognizes that Trinidad and Tobago is a small, vulnerable open island economy, and the Minister reminded us this morning that many of our metrics are still quite robust. $7.3 billion in foreign exchange, 8.7 months of cover. Our debt to GDP levels at 72%, worrying, but still within range, and our HS&F fund at $5.9 billion. The acid truth is that it is not business as usual, and thoughtful systemic change is going to be required, not minor tinkering, but thoughtful change at the systemic level, and that's required now. And it's required by all of us as stakeholders, whether you're community-based organizations, faith-based organizations, NGOs, civil society, and labor. All of us have to make the change, and none of us is immune. And the truth is, when you look at quarter 3 and quarter 4 of 2020, and you look into 2021, what with energy prices, ammonia, methanol, and other commodity prices, volatility in terms of our investment returns, loan loss provisions that are likely to accrue coming into Q3 and Q4, it tells us that the road ahead for 2021 and certainly to 2022 is likely to be as difficult with an embedded deficit of between $3 to $5 billion. Our report looked at Vision 2030 and made some important adjustments to 2030, bringing forward some items and introducing some new items into our thinking. The recommendations are done by sector and they're done by industry, which allows ministries to be able to look at them, to interrogate them, to adapt them, and we are going to make ourselves available as a committee to be able to work with ministries because we need a private sector, labor, civil society, government effort to move the economy forward to sustained growth. We cannot go back to where we were, sort of bouncing around at 0% growth. What's also important is that this is going to require critical legislative change. The Drogas Act, the Fisheries Act, a slew of modifications in terms of financial services legislation, construction legislation in terms of town and country planning, the Engineers Act. So it is going to require the support of the opposition thoughtfully as we move this process forward. Government alone can't do it. From an implementation standpoint, we have some very clear implementation options. Our suggestion is a number of high-level teams need to be appointed, including the private sector and including labor, which report directly into the office of the Prime Minister. And in too many instances, we have cases where the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Trade, you have to go to get a document resolved. You have Chemistry, Food and Drugs, and another ministry. We have to rationalize the reporting to several of these ministries as part of our process moving forward, and to adopt the model of develop TT and fast track that, adopt the model of TT Engage, so that if you want to come to Trinidad and Tobago and you want to do business, you're only going into one portal. Sri Lanka did that, and immediately they benefited from $4.5 billion of additional revenue from a foreign direct exchange standpoint coming into the country. Many of the recommendations that we make are on a multi-year basis. WASA, TNTech have significant implications for the manufacturing sector in terms of inputs, and therefore how we sequence those, how we manage that, and how we compensate them, how we manage that process is also going to be important. Communication is also going to be important as well. How do we manage the teams? How do we communicate with the public? How do we communicate with key stakeholders? How do they embed the transition and the transformational plans into their own industry plans and to their own company plans with impact in terms of receivables, revenues, etc., is also going to be very important. I won't get into the specifics in terms of enabling environment and ease of doing business. That has been addressed by, I think, several of my colleagues. In terms of some specific things, if you take a look at the period 2020 to 2023, it is clear to us that we're going to be faced with a deficit for those years. And one of the key things that we have got to do is, and one of the prime movers is our gas value chain negotiations. What happens in the energy sector? And therefore, support of the work of Minister Young, Minister Khan, and the team in that area is absolutely important to create a new equilibrium to ensure that we have an investable chain for the upstreamers, an investable chain for the midstreamers, and work in terms of feedstock prices for the downstreamers. Even while looking abroad at opportunities from an acquisition standpoint, know that multiples are low, and it allows players in different sectors of the market to change the correlations and to also provide some remittance income and some new income coming in. The other area that I think is important is to identify some new sources of revenue. And so the report identifies new sources of revenue in fintechs, in agriculture, in maritime, in manufacturing, in construction. And those are areas that we absolutely have to explore because we have to get the revenue curve up. We can't continue to be in a $40 billion range with embedded expenditure of $40 billion. So, Minister, we have to address both the revenue side and we have to address the expenditure side. In terms of the revenue side, we suggest that we take a look at PPPs, public-private partnerships. A portfolio of those can be developed. We have to take a look at the regulatory regime around that. We have to take a look at capacity inside of there. And we have to start prepping those assets in terms of their readiness legally, their readiness operationally, leadership, and the revenue flow to make them attractive, even as we look at non-strategic assets, which could help us in terms of diversification as well. So it's not business as usual. The Guaracara asset, which is formerly the Petrotrin plant, represents about $5 billion of assets. On an interest expense basis alone, at 6%, you're talking $300 million a year gone. In terms of maintenance, it probably is another $200 to $300 million in maintenance a year. And unless we bring that as we rehabilitate that asset, the cost is going to increase, and the difficulty in bringing back the project, bringing back the plant and line is going to increase in difficulty. And then, of course, you have the opportunity cost of income. So when you add $300 million, then another $200 or $300 million in maintenance, and then another $200 million in opportunity costs, that's an $800 million opportunity, but we need to move it along fairly quickly. And so perhaps the team that is responsible for that needs to get a mandate in this time now to say between 90 and 120 days, complete the negotiations, support it, be very supportive, be very deliberate, and let's move to get that asset back up because it has a tremendous impact on the Marabella community, on the Point Lisas community, on the San Fernando community. The other area that I think we need to take a look at in terms of some revenue generation is how can we use some of our government agencies, which are STARS And too often we have to wait on outsiders to say to Trinidad and Tobago, you have stars. The IPL had to say to us, Sunil Narayan is a great bowler. The IPL had to say to us, Kyron Pollard is a great all-rounder. So you have agencies like NIPDEC. You have agencies like UDICOT. UDICOT is doing a host of hospitals on an annual basis, a host of infrastructural works, highways, roads, hotels, etc. But we have Ghana next door, which is on its 13th fine. So let us craft a regional cooperation agreement in terms of energy to provide support. But let us also take some of our state agencies where there is strong project management capability, where there is strong project execution capability, strong contract administration capability. And let's really use the biobubble from a Caribbean standpoint and find innovative ways to use the embedded capacity in these organizations to turn them into revenue-generating possibilities for us. So this is the time where I think we have to think differently. We have to think outside of the box. We have to take a look at our capability and see how can we turn this around to our benefit, even while there's COVID, and while for us there's the biobubble. My final comment is around transfers and subsidies. Transfers and subsidies is approximately 50 to 53% of our current spend. We cannot continue at a $10 billion trajectory. And the question for us is all of that $10 billion being efficiently spent? How might we use data and a unique national identifier to ensure that there's no double dipping inside of there? How can we reduce the cost of administration in there? How can we rationalize the 330 programs across a host of different ministries and cause people to graduate from these programs where they could graduate after 6 or 9 months using the Canadian model so that we move people from simply being recipients of transfers and subsidies to being dignified contributors in our economy, because we can no longer afford it, but people themselves want to move out of that. So, Minister, this is a wonderful opportunity for us, I think, to engage in some transformational change. For us to reimagine the economy, and the roadmap to recovery report attempts to do that. I think your presentation this morning was both sobering, but also to remind us that in every crisis there's an opportunity, and let's all collectively put our imagination together, put our thoughts together, be concerted, be deliberate, be focused, and be results-oriented, so that we can look back and say, we really leverage the opportunities out of COVID-19. Thank you very much, Minister.
Thank you very much, Professor Jerry Brooks, co-chair of the Roadmap to Recovery Committee. Now, based on all that has been said today, particularly with the industry leaders, of course, the underlying factor that we are hearing is that it's not business as usual. And Professor Brooks mentioned, that we have to reimagine our society. We have some sacrifices to make, and I know that together we're going to get there post-COVID-19, because we have survived stuff like this in the past, and we're going to do it again. At this time, we want to get interactive. We want to get you involved. For those of you that are viewing us, we have a live audience, socially distanced, well within the public health regulations. And we want to pitch it to you now to get involved, to ask a question. So we're going to be taking some questions from those in the room and also virtually too as well. We want to know who you would direct the question to, and we will read out the question and direct it to any one of our leaders on stage. And we do have a question. It's from Anil Ramjit. He says, what's the cost to purchase our own desalinization plant? I don't know who wants to take that. I don't know.
I'll take that. We have no intention of doing any such thing.
Okay.
We have to move away from desalinated water into surface water.
Okay.
So we won't be doing that.
Okay. All right, so we have a next question from Couva Chamber of Commerce. Are there more reserves of natural gas within Trinidad and Tobago's inshore and offshore borders? And if so, in what quantities? Can Mr. Luqman take that?
Well, if you take the inshore, or I should say onshore, you will have seen some recent discoveries with Touchstone, and we would have signed some, or enter into discussions now. So that's, I would say, the more we can encourage those kinds of things, that is a good source of, I guess, lower capital cost gas that is available. So that is certainly going on now in a big way with Touchstone. In terms of the offshore, what you see, there certainly are reserves. And you see developments that are continuing now with Barracuda and Colibri, with Shell. So those are proceeding. You see the Cassia compression with BP. And then you would have just seen BHP signing on the Ruby gas supply to replace depleting of 2C and so on. It's a bit early on the deep water, as you know, but that is more intended and more time for the latter part of the decade. So in terms of now, the focus is really on the developments which look positive. In other words, though we're in this difficult situation, you still see the development proceeding on the Shell, Colibri, and Barracuda, and so on. And the deep water discussions, that's still going on. So the answer to that is yes. That's encouraging to see. But what has happened in the new environment, of course, is the exploration would have been pushed off. Okay. So that will result in some delays in the outcome of those. The cross-border gas, you see that, of course, there's been tremendous changes on the focus towards Manatee and Shell on our side. That continues, I know, very aggressively with Shell. It's still early days with Grenada and so on, so I won't comment too much on that. But that's the rough state of affairs, which essentially shows that, you know, by 2022, you start to see the gas supply hopefully increasing again.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Luqman. And we have questions.
Just want to add some more specificity to what Mr. Luqman said. The country's gas reserves, after the 2019 audit, which was only presented to the Cabinet last week, from Ryder Scott and Associates, give the country just over 10 trillion cubic feet of proven reserves. That's approximately 8.5 years of reserves to production ratio. If we add probable reserves to that, it takes us to 14 years. The true upside is called possible reserves. And you have to migrate possible into the category of probable and proven. We are fortunate that the BHP Deepwater Drilling Exploration Program has, for the time being, been quite successful. They have so far proven just around 3.5 to 5 trillion cubic feet of gas. They are currently in the market development phase to determine whether that is commercially feasible for commercialization and development. If all goes well, that production could come into the country hopefully by 2026. One of the main things the government did after the Dragon gas deal was aborted because of the US sanction. There's a field called Laurel and Manatee, which straddles the boundary between Venezuela and Trinidad. There was a unitization treaty between the government of Trinidad and Tobago and the government of Venezuela. Under a unitization treaty, once gas reserves exist across an international boundary, no one country can develop it on its own. It has to be unitized. So it has to be a joint development between both parties. What this government successfully did under some high-level diplomacy led by the Prime Minister and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and to a lesser extent, the Minister of Energy, was to decouple the unitization treaty so that Trinidad has now been allowed, based on negotiation with the Venezuelan government, to develop the Manatee side of that gas, 10 trillion cubic feet of cross-border reserves, 27% of which belongs to Trinidad. So Shell, which owns the Trinidad acreage on our side, is now working on a development plan as we speak to develop 2.7 trillion cubic feet of gas, hopefully for production by 2025. So from a gas reserves point, in a fairly comfortable position. The challenge, obviously, the economics, the LNG price over the long term, petrochemical price, which was articulated quite clearly today. But from a production side and from a reserve side, we are in a relatively comfortable position, and we continue to monitor the market. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Franklin Cahn. We have another question from Richard Young. He asks, do you think digital transformation can be an excellent catalyst to mobilize the economy, not forgetting that there's an opportunity to bring about greater collaboration, which he emphasized, between public and private sectors? I don't know which one would like to answer that.
Perhaps I can just take an initial stab. I think the answer to that question is yes. I think it's an excellent opportunity. If you think about the fintech sector, animation, gaming, the creative industries, those are all products that lend themselves to digital transformation. But digital transformation should not be regarded as a simple fix. There are many components that have to be thought through in terms of digital transformation. For example, the role of TAT in terms of spectrum, the role of TSTT in terms of hotspots, infrastructure, and copper have to be worked through very carefully. Content, the Khan Academy in the US provides a host of training and has developed a real operation in terms of content. We have to build out content. And that content could be exported even in times like now when you don't have entertainment taking place. You also have the question of what are you going to prioritize? We have some very good work taking place by government in terms of Develop TT and by NGC in terms of TT Engage. Those are excellent platforms which can attract foreign direct investment to Trinidad and Tobago and which can improve our competitiveness from 105 very significantly up and as well attract foreign direct investment. There's also going to be a legislative component to digital transformation. And that legislative component is going to require thoughtful modernization of our legislation in the construction sector, in the financial services sector, in the maritime sector with the establishment of a maritime authority. So it is not a simple naive fix. It is a lot of thoughtful work that is going to have to take place. It is also going to require some very painful decisions. Because if we talk about digitizing the public sector, you're really talking about public sector reform and the role of the Public Service Commission and independence and rules and workflows and procedures. So it is a deep and profound change. It is a seismic change. It is an important change, and where some cultural work is also would have to take place as well in terms of the new expectations of people, in terms of KPIs and standards, as well as working arrangements when you work from home. So it is a very comprehensive issue that we've got to address with a plan, with platforms in different ministries, with the work of interoperability, feeding back into legislation, and with reports on a continuous basis, we require some considerable some considerable investment as well. So the simple answer is yes, it is something that we have to do. The world is digitizing, and it's going to be an important element of our competitiveness.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Brooks. We have a first member of the media, Stephen Cummings from 98.1 FM. He has a question for somebody from the panel.
Yes, good afternoon to the panel. I just have two quick questions. One can be addressed by the Minister of Finance and then the other by Professor Brooks. I would start with the Finance Minister. Minister Imbert, as a country, we have been doing business very poorly on the ease of doing business side. Our competitive index, we saw where we were at 66 and now we dropped to 105. What should we be doing differently now going into 2021, post-COVID-19, to improve our competitiveness as a country? And Professor Brooks, could you share a little more on part 2 of the roadmap for recovery? I know you mentioned a couple of important areas, but I'd be interested to know exactly, a little more of what the part 2, phase 2 is actually saying, and of course its implications for Trinidad and Tobago moving us forward. Thank you.
Okay. There is a tendency to believe that the Ministry of Finance is responsible for many things that we are not. For example, the whole question of the ease of doing business. We have a division called the Customs Division, which is significant, in terms of the ease of doing business. But for too long, we've played lip service to this phrase. This really requires a whole-of-government approach. All government ministers and ministries have to get involved. The Ministry of Trade, the Ministry of Public Administration, Ministry of National Security. Everybody has to get involved to solve these problems, because I myself have been in public life now for almost 30 years, and I've been hearing of issues with customs, with immigration, with the public service, with virtually every single government department, town, country planning. I've been hearing about that for 35 years. The only way we can solve this problem and make it easier for us to do business as a country is everybody gets involved. And we stop paying lip service to these concepts, and we actually set targets with every government ministry putting their shoulders to the wheel and achieving targets of improving competitiveness and business. That's my answer to that, because it is not, as Minister of Finance, I will deliver a budget and I will speak about many things, but I am just talking really from an economic perspective and from a perspective of giving concessions and incentives towards businesses to invest and that sort of thing. But finance is not the primary actor in all of this, and everybody has to get involved, every single ministry. So that's my answer to that.
Professor Brooks?
Thank you. First of all, let me thank you for the question. It's going to be very difficult to speak to all of the elements of the Phase 2 report in 2 or 3 minutes, except to say that it addresses things like food security, a $500 million stimulus in terms of agriculture, where we propose the adoption of technology, precision agriculture, buy local campaign, eat local and grow local campaign, use of artificial intelligence in agriculture, deepen that linkage between food production and retail sales. It addresses manufacturing, a host of recommendations under manufacturing, including the ease of doing business, access to foreign exchange, using our embassies as trade facilitation offices. It addresses construction with a host of recommendations in construction. It talks about the business of being shovel-worthy rather than being shovel-ready. That is really assessing projects. We have 527 projects that will rekindle, the additional 72 that we're looking at from a shovel-worthiness standpoint, but really using a scorecard and linking that back to our development as a country to ensure that those projects are the kinds of projects that will move us forward. The use of PPPs, the use of asset sales. It addresses the question of innovation and entrepreneurship, which is central to what we're doing, digitization, the ease of doing business, creating an enabling environment. It also looks at the financial services sector. It looks at sports, the creative industries, and has an implementation focus attached to it. This is not meant to be an academic document. It's meant to be a pragmatic document which is capable of being implemented, where we can work with ministries and across sectors to be able to move us forward. It also importantly addresses the social security network, ensures that the social security network remains in place, because you must leave no one behind, and we don't want to risk any social issues. And at the same time, graduate people graduate people from their current circumstances to dignified work.
Thank you.
I'd just like to say one more thing. I'd like to give a practical example of a ministry dealing with something proactively and doing something that is almost amazing. And I had to ask my colleague, the Minister of National Security, when I saw a press conference about removing the backlog of passports and also initiating a system whereby you can get your passport renewals by post in 7 days. I had to ask him, is this true? And he assured me it was true. And the whole point is that is something that a ministry has done, not the Ministry of Finance. The Ministry of National Security has taken upon itself to deal with this perennial problem. I've been hearing about delays with passports since I entered politics in 1991. So I think it is really an achievement, and I wanted to say that this government has been able to put a system in place where you can receive a renewed passport in the post in a week or two. And that is an example of a ministry, doing what it's supposed to do and making it much easier for people to do business.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Professor Brooks. We have a next question, this time from Couva Chamber. They're asking, what is being done to preserve our energy security?
What does that mean?
Anyone?
Yes, sure. I can take a stab at it.
Anyone?
But I'm sure the Minister of Energy is also. Let me look at the questions a little bit. Right, okay. So I would say in terms of the energy security area, as I started talking about, the focus had been on securing gas supply for the future. And a lot of the last few years has been centered around stabilizing that situation. So in terms of meeting downstream obligations and things like that, that has been the focus over the last years. Quite apart from that, there has been a lot of discussions with the upstreamers, of course, in the last years with the ministry and with all the players in terms of developments in the upstream. So the energy security, we have to think broader than just the minister talked about the reserve side, right? And you see a lot of work going on in the area of the value chain. And the value chain is really, there was a gas master plan that was done back in 2015, but the gas master plan had no reference. It was a document looking backwards in terms of how value was going to the country. If you look at the value chain work that's going on now with gas strategies, it's really looking forward for the next decade. And that will actually, it has to start with information on how that information is actually aggregated and collected so that you can see where the next cliff is going to be, so to speak. And there's been a lot of work trying to look forward, and that's going on now with the value chain work. So the energy security issue, of course, I said you're going through a tough time, and it will continue to be so for the next, until the end of next year, depending on how the economies recover. You're not seeing the, big steep increases in LNG or petchem prices, but it's the period to actually become efficient, and it's the period to actually, try to collaborate quite differently. So this is bigger than just, as I said, you're in a market-driven economy, and really only the most efficient can survive. But having said that, it's also a collaboration that's going on right now across the chain, and everybody is trying to survive, right, over the next period. The investments that are being made are not, if you talk to the upstreamers, there's a lot of investments going on. One upstreamer says that they invest $1 billion every year to stay flat, right? So it's a lot of investment going on the upstream side. The downstreamers are, of course, exposed to different changes going on there and going further away. And therefore, the value chain work, as I said before, has to be a guide beyond the gas master plan done in 2015. It has to be a guide how you go forward, recognizing that one, it's going to be tough in the next year or two, and two, the whole focus on how the oil and gas industry is facing the carbon neutral climate change issues. So we have to position ourselves, as I said, with new services, new industries, and rethink, even as Professor Brooks said, the use of the technology and data, how we actually get through, not only for ourselves and for the players in the chain, but how all the technology that we're using today and all the, what COVID has taught us is we can be agile. We can use technology, even as a state entity, to quickly improve how things flow through the system. So that is a result of COVID accelerating technology. But there's also technology that we look at just to run our business and look at land slips on pipeline and look at how that data is collected with a GIS department. And you can see, well, if you start thinking a little broader than NGC or any company, we can actually make a difference to the value. It's hard to believe, for example, that the food import bill is 6 billion or so. Am I right, Vishnu? A year. But we also say at the same time that we export the most fertilizer in the world, right? One of the top exporters. And something doesn't add up when you start to look at that. So can we bring technology, R&D, can we start to work differently that causes that to go down? And even the water leaks that we experience, can we use the technology to identify it and address it before it gets a lot worse? Can we work differently like that? And we have data, we have technology, so I think in terms of energy security, back to the question, it's a matter of looking strategically down the road for the next decade and seeing where we need to position ourselves. Bearing in mind, oil as a future is actually going down. Gas as a percentage of the mix is also going down. It'll be 13% by 2050 compared to 24%. Renewables is clearly on the rise, so I think we do have to position ourselves in new areas as well. So I'm not talking in a traditional sense right now.
Thank
that was
you
a long answer to a question. But.
Thank you very much, and you may have to answer some more. We have two more questions from the Cooper Chamber. One of them is, are there more reserves of natural gas within Trinidad and Tobago's inshore and offshore borders? And if so, in what quantities? Also, they're asking, can we give more permits to smaller players? And they list some examples, De Novo Energy, Touchstone, etc., to exploit the smaller natural gas fields.
Well, I think question 1 was asked already and answered.
By the Minister.
Asked and answered by the Minister of Energy. Right. So, and I think question 2, I think the answer is yes. So, perhaps we could look at some questions on the actual budget and the economy itself.
Yes, okay. All right, so we have a question from a member of our live audience. Yes, sir? Can you state your name and your question and who you're directing it to? Thank you.
Testing 1. My name is Clyde Elder. I am the Secretary General of the Communication Workers Union. I want to direct my questions to the Honorable Colm Imbert, Minister of Finance. I have a series of questions, actually. First one concerns pension, what is pension plans? As we know that pensions form a significant chunk of monies that I would say are in reserve. And if we, in fact, look at ways of maybe removing the pension cap, I'm saying pension cap in terms of the NIS amount and the amount from other sources, which is capped, I think, is at $6,000 at this point in time. But if we could either remove it or, in fact, increase it without increasing the senior citizens grant, of course, that's not my request. But if we can remove that cap, so it allows pension plans that has enough money to then give more income to their pensioners or the senior citizens, it in fact is a way of putting more money in the economy. That's one point I want to make, and maybe ask you if there's any consideration to do that. And the second question, you said that government has been subsidizing WASA, TNTech, but you have not been subsidizing TSTT. And I want to make the point that government owes TSTT at this point in time about $1 billion. Now, I want to take out from that the controversial contract that is about $500 million. So if I take out from that $500 million, it means government owes TSTT about $500 million. I had asked since before the retrenchment of the 500 TSTT workers for government to pay its debt to TSTT, and that has not been done. I want to ask again, this is not about subsidy, this is about paying the government's debt, what you owe to an entity. I want to ask again, if there's any way or anything in the budget that deals with government debt, especially to a state entity, well, 51% state-owned entity, such as TSTT, And of course, with that,
I can only deal with 3 questions. Then there's it, 3.
yes, with that, I want to also maybe ask what is going on with the 49% cable and wireless shares. And just one more before I go. The CARICOM bubble, of course, I want us to be part of it. I want to urge the country to be part of it because the CARICOM bubble also affects and will affect the hotel industry, and we also represent Hilton workers. So I want to just take the opportunity to urge the country to do what we can to bring down our numbers to at least 20 or less so that we could be part of the CARICOM bubble, so that we could see the future of the Hilton Hotel as well as even this same Hyatt Hotel that we are in. So, Minister, I await your response. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Elder, that's quite a lot of questions there. And perhaps, moderator, we could limit people to no more than 2. Otherwise, I think we'll get a bit lost. With respect to the first point, I wasn't clear on what was being asked. Right now, we have a cap on persons who are in receipt of senior citizens pension and NIS pension. I got the impression that what Mr. Elder was asking was about private pension plans, which would have nothing to do with senior citizens pension or NIS pension. And certainly I would need to get some more clarity from him. His union is exactly what they have in mind. If pension plans are in surplus and they can make greater payments to their members, then certainly that is something to be encouraged. But I would have to get clarity from him on that. With respect to the debt owed by the government to TSTT, that is news to me. So I will have to speak to the relevant people, the board of TSTT and the line minister with respect to that. There was also a question about the CARICOM bubble.
Could you clarify the question in CARICOM bubble?
I really could not remember everything. Now, what we're asking, yes, we welcome your questions, and we know that you have a lot to mention, and you want to give a story before, but in the interest of time and to properly answer your question, we ask that you limit 1 or 2 questions and make your case short so that we will remember the questions that is asked, right? Right? So we have another question.
What I will say, I will have direct discussions with the communication union on these matters to get more clarity on the actual questions themselves.
Great.
Okay.
So we have another question. First one, 2 questions. How is the Ministry of Finance proposing to tackle improved revenue collection? And the second question, what are the plans for implementing the property tax? Minister, you could.
All right, well, there are only 2 ways, essentially one way of improving revenue collection, and that is greater efficiency. And at this juncture in our history, we must improve revenue collection. We hear many estimates of the uncollected revenue that exists in the system. The estimates vary from $2 billion to $10 billion and so on. It is not clear exactly what it is, but it is obvious that there's a lot of revenue outside there that needs to be dealt with. One of the things we put in the manifesto is that we are committed to a revenue authority. A lot of the work has been done, most of it, and we are committed to establishing a revenue authority in one way or the other in this term, and that is a year 1 priority, the establishment of a revenue authority to improve the efficiency of the revenue collection agencies, the Inland Revenue Division in particular, and Customs in particular. It's simply an efficiency issue. Obviously, it would mean providing more resources, providing more focus and attention. I have noticed the discussion on property tax, but property tax is not new. The Property Tax Act was passed in 2009 or 2010, and we have committed to it in all our manifestos ever since. It's taken a while because of the process. You have to develop what is called a valuation rule. You have to value properties before you can collect. That's how the law is structured. So we are working assiduously towards that. We may make some adjustments to the legislation to make it easier to collect the tax and accelerate the tax, but it is not an issue that is, I think, open for debate. I also want to clear up that the first area that the government has been working on, and this has been publicized for the last 5 years, is residential property tax. I notice a lot of discussion about businesses saying don't collect property tax, etc. But the first area where we're actually doing the valuations is residential properties. And we made it very clear that's first, then commercial, then industrial, then agricultural, and so on. But the fact of the matter is that we have to find new revenue streams. I had an estimate made to me recently by a member of the public, sent me his own calculations, very simple calculations, stating that if we collected $500 per year from persons whose properties were valued at $1 million or less, and $1,000 per year from properties valued between $1 million and $3 million, and so on as you go up, the amount of revenue that is available to us through property tax, which is a revenue stream, and we have to look at new revenue streams, could be as much as $1 billion. And just think about it. Paying $500 a year in property tax, $40 a month, that is not an insurmountable amount for a person. And there are a lot of people who would be outside the net at this point in time that would not be considered. Persons who rent from the HDC, for example, would not have to pay property tax and so on. So there's a lot of misinformation outside there. There's a lot of misunderstanding. And it's something we'll be spending a lot of time clarifying as we move towards accelerating the implementation of that 10-year-old tax. There's nothing new about it.
Thank you. Minister, yes.
Yes, Christian.
Is it working? Yeah. If I may just add to what the minister said, I don't think it's reasonable in any developed economy not to have a property tax. Right? I don't think that's reasonable. And I think there may be some concerns amongst businesses, but this was a tax and a cost of business prior to 2010. So in essence, those businesses that have not paid property tax or individuals have not paid property tax has almost been like a subsidy from the state for a period of 10 years for taxes that you had once or previously paid. And I think secondly, and more importantly, Minister, given the choice, I think businesses would prefer to face a property tax than an increase in income tax.
Yeah.
So given the choice, I think it is reasonable that we have a reinstatement of the property tax.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mote. We have another question, this time from Carla Stephanie. She asks, is there any up-to-date data on unemployment? It appears the figure used in the graph presented is for late 2018. Has there been any evaluation of the impact of COVID-19 on labor and unemployment, as well as business closures?
I must say that it has been a source of great concern to me over the last 5 years in the Ministry of Finance that we have been unable to get up-to-date employment figures from the Central Statistical Office, and that must change. The figures are late 2018, and they're 2 years out of date. That is simply unacceptable. And I do expect that the Minister of Planning will address this in this term. The fact that our labor data is 2 years out of date, it makes it impossible to plan when you have data that is 2 years out of date. That is something that we must fix.
Okay, thank you. All right, so any other questions from any one of the people? We have another question from Carla Stephanie. She asks, can government give any update on the status of Carnival 2021, especially since this is around the time when preparations start to be made? I don't know which, anybody can. All right. Okay, so the Prime Minister will address that.
Yes,
Yes.
that
Okay,
was kind of picking up.
So thank you. Mr. Prime Minister.
I think we'll address it in his one,
Oh, okay. Okay, so the Prime Minister just mentioned to me that when he comes to speak, he will address that situation, okay? Thank you. All right, so we have a member of the audience. Can you please state your name, who you're representing, and who you're directing the question to? Thank you.
Riaz Ahmad, President of the Trinidad and Tobago Chamber of Industry and Commerce. I have two questions directed to the Minister of Finance. The first question is, the Chamber has written about companies have to pay taxes in 2020 based upon prior year profits, which in many cases would have been much higher. And we find that this would be very difficult for companies, given what they've been going through in 2020, to pay taxes on 2019. And as we have always said, and we have heard today, that it's not business as usual. The second question is regarding the overdue VAT refunds. We know that some VAT refunds have been paid in cash and also in bonds. We want you to get an update on the status of all was paid and what is outstanding to be paid. Thank you.
Sure. The whole question of how companies are measured or valued or required to pay corporation tax based on prior year business and prior year profits in the context of a pandemic is something that we at Finance are looking at very carefully. But there is a flip side, because next year, when you submit your returns for this year, if the law remains unchanged, it means next year you'll be paying taxes on a much lower amount, even though the economy might be recovering. So there are both pros and cons to this. Yes, there are some businesses this year that are paying quarterly taxes based on last year's revenue. But next year and the year after, if the law remains unchanged, you may actually be paying quarterly taxes that are lower than they should be. So it's a complex issue, but it is something we will be having in-depth discussions with the business community on to see whether we can find consensus on the way forward. That's the answer to that. With respect to VAT refunds, my last check is that we would have paid about $3.5 billion in the COVID period. About $3 billion in bonds, not about, we actually paid the whole $3 billion in bonds that we promised to pay. I got a report recently, and approximately $500 million in cash refunds. So you're talking $3.5 billion. That is what we have been able to afford so far. We have to press pause for a little while and then look forward into 2021 to see what we can do about VAT refunds in 2021. But you have seen in the manifesto that that is an area of focus where we want to try and get to the point where VAT refunds are current. But that is not something that would be immediate. But to answer your question, we've paid out about $3.5 billion over the last couple months in VAT refunds, in bonds and in cash.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister. Well, we have no more further virtual questions. Are there anyone? Okay, so yes. So please state your name, the company, the business that you represent, the sector, and who you're directing the question to.
Yes, good afternoon. This is Dax Driver from the Energy Chamber, representing, unsurprisingly, the energy sector. So two questions. First one for Jerry Brooks on the roadmap to recovery. So you'd mentioned the potential of government agencies to expand their offerings around the region. I wonder if you could comment on the potential of the Trinidad private sector to expand its offerings around the region, and what has to happen with how the CARICOM single market and economy is operating in order for those opportunities really to be grasped, and what can happen, for example, with free movement of people. Second question to Mr. Mark Luqwan of the National Gas Company. Mark, could you just comment on energy efficiency overall in Trinidad and Tobago? You talked about the petrochemical plants and how there's a variety of efficiencies there, but what's the opportunity with energy efficiency for the overall economy, and what can be done other than making it a little bit warm. I'm very cold at the back of this room. It's a bit crazy here in the tropics, and I'm shivering at the back of the room. Other than fixing how hotels organize their air conditioning, are there other things that can happen overall with energy efficiency in the economy?
Okay, Professor Brooks.
Dr. Driver, thank you very much for the question. I spoke initially about the regional energy framework and the use of state-to-state arrangements, memorandum of understanding, regional cooperation agreements to create a framework and architecture in which state companies can engage some of our regional counterparts and use of the bio bubble as well. That plays out in energy. It could play out in the construction sector. And really the thinking there, Dr. Driver, was to use that as a lead to support private sector engagement, private sector company to private sector company. Right now, I think the Ministry of Trade is doing an excellent job in terms of missions, but some key sectors, if you wanted to take a look at them sort of sector by sector, in manufacturing, we have a host of manufacturers with spare capacity. This is an excellent opportunity now to get into some of those markets, but the key here is, in part, foreign exchange and access to foreign exchange. Also, to the ease of doing business is something which needs to be addressed in terms of several of these companies to ensure capacity and utilization of capacity. It really comes down to sector by sector and how do we build capacity, how do we build human capacity in the sectors, and also to what do we do in terms of our product portfolio. How do we tweak our product portfolio and ensure that the logistics is in place as well as the ease of doing business is in place. So there's some very specific recommendations in terms of the manufacturing sector. Access to foreign exchange is key inside of there. Financing is also key. The role of Exim Bank, the role of Export TT in terms of looking at market and looking at market opportunities, not only from a Caribbean standpoint, but from an extra-regional standpoint. But there's also an important opportunity to think dynamically as well. And I'll just use the construction sector as an example. Imagine a UDICOT or imagine NIDCO or imagine one of our private sectors going across and partnering with a company in Guyana and working with Guyana to put on hotels, to put on infrastructure, to put on roads. So that you're building capacity from a private sector standpoint, but you could also take that capacity and go beyond Guyana in terms of a cooperative arrangement to other territories as well as you build out capacity. It's also an opportunity, Dax, for us to take a look at other jurisdictions as well in terms of inorganic growth opportunities. Because multiples are low in many jurisdictions, it's an opportunity for us to be acquisitive because we have $13 billion of capital parked. And the question is, how do we employ that private capital park now to be able to generate returns? So really, it's the product portfolio, it's innovation and entrepreneurship, working with the University of the West Indies, for example, in things like cross-laminated timber, in terms of supporting micro and small businesses, the 720 firms in the energy sector, the 40,000 persons employed, the 52,000 persons employed in the manufacturing sector, and really being thoughtful around it. We have a host of retirees now who have gotten their pensions and monies from Petrotrin. This is an opportunity for us to form consortia around those people and to say, how could we use those skills and those competencies and those resources, put an organization around it, and go out and service companies in the region and extra-regionally. You also have opportunities from an energy sector in terms of small-scale energy, LNG, and to be able to go out to firms to electricity companies across the region and to substitute diesel and to substitute heavy oils with natural gas, small-scale LNG, etc. So there are many threads to the question, and there are many areas of opportunity. The key really is for us, from a roadmap standpoint, to take a look at the specifics in terms of agriculture, energy, Tobago, for example, in terms of hard rock into Guyana, hospitality, the creative industry, sports and tourism, and to really tread through those industry by industry, building capacity, ensuring that there's an ease of doing business, ensuring there's access to finance, and ensuring that there's the skill building and competency to be able to support it.
Thank you, Professor Brooks.
If I may,
yes, sure.
I just wanted to add to one point that Jerry touched on, and I know this is covered in the roadmap document. For example, we signed a trade agreement maybe 12 years ago with Costa Rica. And we signed this free trade agreement, and very quickly after that, Costa Rica put boots on the ground in Trinidad, put resources here, and decided, we've got this free trade agreement. Let's now use that agreement as a means of exporting product into Trinidad and Tobago. They did exactly what it is that they were supposed to do, to take advantage of that free trade agreement. On the other side, so they put people here to assist the Costa Rica private sector and how to navigate the market in Trinidad and Tobago, the laws, importation, all of the information that they would need, finding local partners for distribution, handling logistics. By the same token, we had signed the agreement, and Costa Rica was now open to our manufacturers. But on our side, we didn't put the infrastructure in place. We didn't have the people on the ground. We didn't provide the assistance to the private sector, having opened the market in a sense for our manufacturers. We then didn't provide the assistance that was necessary in any meaningful way to allow our manufacturers then to penetrate that market. As a result, outside, and I can't speak for the energy sector, but as a result, what we've seen is a significant one-way movement of trade between our two countries. And similarly with Dominican Republic. So the point is we can execute better, especially with countries where we have signed free trade agreements, where the government and the private sector can partner better to ensure that we penetrate the markets where we have freer access. And that's a really a key area for potential expansion and opportunity for our manufacturers. Just to touch on one sector.
Thank you, Mr. Mute. Mr. Luqman.
Addressing the question around energy efficiency, the question was, is there anything else that we can be doing? And I know the government has started some initiatives with LED bulbs and all of these kinds of issues. But if you look at the whole, some of the countries that are dealing with this issue, they're establishing a very clear roadmap on the energy mix that is required. So are there things we can do? There's some short-term things and there's some long-term things, but you have to put it in the order of some of the best practice countries have very specific agencies, for example, that are set up for energy efficiency and monitoring and legislation and policy frameworks that impact the whole issue of energy efficiency. It doesn't happen because, we wish it. It happens because, particularly in Trinidad, where on the gas side, where there's an efficient use of molecules going into the power sector and not getting paid for it, as you mentioned, as opposed to putting the effort on the renewables for the power. Energy efficiency affects the demand side. And the countries that have done well in that, like Chile and so on, you can see that they have very clear legislation frameworks, sort of standards around energy efficiency. Any appliance, vehicle that you use, it's also coded, color-coded, what is high efficiency, low efficiency, and there are standards that are being put in place, as well as education that kind of goes right through the whole, from kindergarten to the adults. And it's a cultural thing too, as we know. It's behaviors, it's patterns, and it's also generating an environment of how energy is used and how it's measured. And it gets back to what I talked about in the beginning, the whole green agenda and positioning ourselves. If you look at how the other countries in the Caribbean are also trying to deal with it and the region, if we also build up some of these services, we can also apply knowledge in other areas, generate income that way. So there are other things if we look at it. I saw a report, I think the Energy Chamber had a report, that if you had, back in 2015, if you look at the residential, commercial, industrial sectors and so on, the savings that I read there, DAX was around over 300 million, So it wasn't small money, and I have no way to verify it now. You need to look at it, but it certainly wasn't small money.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Luqman. All right. So if there are no more questions, we'll ask the Honorable Prime Minister of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago can we please stand as we welcome the Honorable Prime Minister to give his closing remarks.
I'll come afterwards.
Please, please. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, all present here at the Hyatt and those of you who followed us outside of this building. I want to thank you very much for your time, your attention, and your contributions. We had scheduled to complete this assignment at 1:30, but I promise you I hope not to detain you until then. But I couldn't pass up the opportunity to say a genuine thanks and also to clarify and associate with some of the issues touched on today, because I know much of what we touched on today would be the subject of further deliberations, discussions, and arguments going forward into the coming weeks and probably months and even years. Let me just mention there are about 6 things I want to touch on without making a long speech. I won't detain you too long. Debt. You would have heard me addressing the United Nations a couple of days ago, and in the speech, speaking as a Caribbean Prime Minister of a small island developing state, associating Trinidad and Tobago as a middle-income country, but being small island with restrictive resources, saying to the international community that international agencies should find ways of treating us with some consideration for our circumstance and our predicament, and also associating us with this whole question of debt relief, because debt is now looming as one of the major hurdles that countries like ours would have to face in the immediate and medium term. But let me bring you back to another comment that I had made early on. When we started to confront the coming and the arrival of COVID-19, I said to this country, nobody is going to come to our assistance. We are on our own, and we have to make our own bed and lie on it as we make it. We cannot expect anyone to come to our assistance. That's the reality of the world. That's what's happening. So you ask yourself, how do you square those two positions, where you're expecting help, asking for help, expecting it, and saying at the same time that nobody's going to come to us? I want to say to Trinidad and Tobago that our circumstances, in the context of how the international community measures the circumstances of a people and a country, in these university-generated arrangements of debt to GDP ratio, amount of money for how many months of import cover, how much reserve you have in your hand, and using those yardsticks, Trinidad and Tobago, as a middle-income developing country, we are not to expect to qualify for any debt relief. It's not going to happen. At least we hope it doesn't happen, as something that we are depending on to get ourselves out of this situation. Because if it happens, it means that given the yardsticks that are used to attract the attention of those people we talk to and those who can provide debt relief, we would have to be in a situation far worse than we are in now or anticipate to be in. And we hope never to get there. Because debt relief comes to people who literally have the lender of last resort looming on their doorstep. A country with our reserve position, 7 months of foreign exchange, a revenue stream. What is going to be said to us is manage your affairs. You're better off than most in your circumstance. You're better off than many in the world circumstance. So let us understand that here in Trinidad and Tobago. While we may criticize ourselves with finger-pointing and blame-throwing and personalizing our circumstance for political reasons and others, Trinidad and Tobago is not a basket case. And in the eyes of those we look to outside, we are certainly not attracting the attention of coming with the cavalry to save us. Nobody is coming to our attention and our assistance. We are to be called upon to make the difficult decisions on our own. And that is what the Minister of Finance is going to have to do in putting forward our budget. That is what we're going to have to do as a parliament. That's what we're going to have to do as a people. The next point I want to touch on is the refinery. Somebody mentioned, I think it was Professor Brooks mentioned, that we need to take firm, clear decision on the asset that is the Pointe-à-Pierre refinery. As you know, we have been working alongside, and he suggested that we should set a deadline. I simply want to say that that has already been done. The Minister of Energy had mentioned that the negotiations are now date-specific. We expect to get specific responses in a specific time. And if by the end of October there is no conclusion to the way forward, and by conclusion I mean contractual conclusion between the state and Patriotic, then we will have to look at other options. We hope that we can work out something, because we would much rather have our efforts that have gone on for over a year, I think it was, come to a satisfactory conclusion, but it is not open-ended. So Professor Brooks and the national community, these discussions are not open-ended. And of course, as he would have pointed out, this is a $1 billion contractual arrangement which ought to come to a decent conclusion in the context of business. And while I'm on that, the spokesperson for the union from TSTT made some very definitive statements here which I need to address. One is that the government owes TSTT $1 billion. As head of the cabinet, I know of no such thing. What I do know is that we do owe TSTT some money. TSTT was claiming, and you must remember TSTT is a company 51% owned by the people of Trinidad and Tobago and 49% owned by a foreign company. TSTT was claiming that the arrangement they had with the government for providing cameras had run up a debt of $750 million. This government looked very closely at that and came to the conclusion that there was no basis for that claim. And in fact, as far as the government is concerned, and with our communication with and relationship with TSTT, the government's understanding is that that debt is in the order of approximately $200 million. Recently, the government has provided opportunity for that $200 million to be paid to TSTT. How that came about is that TSTT, as far as the government is concerned, has been in the context of an existing contract and an expired contract, grossly overbilling the taxpayers for the supply of those cameras. So what this government did, instead of accepting TSTT's claim, which resulted in this $750 million debt claim, the government, after tremendous resistance from all sorts of underlings and imps in the system, the government managed to go out and have a public tender for the supply of that service. The bids came in with TSTT bidding $380 million for the service. Another able contractor that was pre-qualified to do it bid $80 million. So in fact, by tender process, we have discovered that TSTT was overbilling the country by $300 million in that arrangement. Of course, we couldn't accept that, to put 49% of that in Cable and Wireless pocket if we want to do that at all. The government awarded the contract to the best bid at $80 million, and that work is underway, and we are in negotiations with TSTT to settle the outstanding debt on a quantum merit basis with the government's offer an approximation of $4 million a month for what TSTT is doing. So it is not the final story, or accurate to say that the government is owing TSTT this $1 billion or $700 million and is portraying it as though we are the cause of any demise of TSTT's business as usual. With respect to the question of a project management company, that's an idea whose time has come. We here in Trinidad and Tobago have considerable experience and raw material in providing project management to ourselves and some of it in the region. We also have a significant pool of young people who can become human capital in a way to not only supply our needs, but to supply the needs of the external, outside our borders, to create economic activity. And certainly, that is one of the areas that the government should and would be a catalyst. Because the history of our country is that invariably there's talk as to what can and should be done in Trinidad and Tobago. But it usually takes the government to be the engine to pull those carriages. And I'm confident that if the government does not get involved and risk some taxpayer resource, that will remain a conversation. We do not want this to remain a conversation. So you would see the government and hopefully private partnership creating an entity which would offer external services, not just to Trinidad and Tobago or to Guyana, but as far away as Ghana, where we are being encouraged to invest. And it requires an entity which the government will offer to the private sector, some element of participation to do exactly what was said here, which is to bring our human capital to bear in providing a quality and quantity of external project management and other investment type services which can contribute to our economic growth outside of the energy sector. We mentioned the whole question of an e-identity and the digitalization of the country. That is going to have to happen. But it's going to have to happen against the background of an understanding that success requires change. Where there's no change, there will be no success in the kinds of things that we are hankering after. And of course, change will initiate conflict. You may recall, those of you who are students of history, that when the world was happy with the horse and buggy and horses providing power for transportation, when the internal combustion engine was invented, the interest in defending the horse and buggy age as the way to go and the thing to keep had argued very strenuously against the noise that was made by the internal combustion engine. And the main point was that it was scaring the horses, and therefore it should not be proceeded with. Not that internal engines for cars and trucks should be advanced, but there were people who were arguing that the thing to do is not scare the horses. But that didn't go very far. But there were other arguments as well, that jobs would be lost. The farriers who were shoeing the horses, those the saddleries that were producing saddles, and those who were designing the wheels and so on for carriages would lose jobs. And there was a very strong argument that the internal combustion engine that gave rise to the motor cars should not come about for those reasons. Fortunately, those changes were made, and today we are not in the horse and buggy age still. There are going to be changes required, and those changes have to be seen in the context of an improvement for efficiency, for opportunity, and for growth. As we digitize government data and private sector data, interface them for a new society, for a new governance model, for ease of doing business models, there will be changes, but expect that there will be resistance to those changes. I'm not speaking here on anecdotal matters. I'm talking about experience. I know how long we took to try to get Asecuda working in the Customs Department in Trinidad and Tobago. I know the level of resistance that we faced because I've been around long enough. I know the resistance that the government faced in putting the licensing office on computers. I know the resistance that we are expecting. But I also know that there's a commitment from this government to face those changes for the future that we are, in fact, going to grasp now and not to lose the opportunities forced upon us by the requirements to do better. I heard about Carnival. Ladies and gentlemen, in 72 hours we'd be in October. And if at this time in October we are still in the throes of a pandemic, it would be madness to be talking about Carnival in February. I see no future for Carnival in Trinidad and Tobago in the months ahead. And today I can put everybody on notice that unless there's some dramatic wind that will blow across us, whereby Christmas pandemic would have been a thing of the past, Carnival in Trinidad and Tobago in 2021 is not on. Picture Juve morning, but with the coronavirus still a major issue, not only in Trinidad and Tobago, but in the world around us. It's just not on. Let us be thankful that we are still alive to see each other's face. Let us remember what our country passed through in 1918. Let us understand what is happening in countries abroad that have not been able to control the spread among its population. And in those examinations and review, a carnival, which is the perfect environment for the spreading of the virus, is not something that we can countenance at this time. This decision, I know, will have serious economic knock-on effects, things that we would lose in terms of the economy. But by the same token, we can't hope to gain on that swing and die on the merry-go-round. Ladies and gentlemen, the final point I want to make is on this issue of corruption. Trinidad and Tobago will not improve its circumstance in any dramatic way if we still defend the instances of corruption in this country and the systems that propagate and defend corruption. Because a lot of what we can't account for in our own corners, our own behavior, our own resource use, and our institutional degradation is as a result of the preservation of corrupt practice, which we are daily falling behind in coping with. What that digitalization will do is to bring about greater accountability, because it will have names, numbers, times, dates, and access of data. And that will allow us to make a quantum leap in the public service and the private sector interfacing with the public service. In a few weeks, I hope, we would be able to institute what everybody is calling for, which is the procurement legislation. Soon after the budget, we expect that that would be fully implemented. But I want to put the country on notice. What that legislation does is to bring a whole lot more people involved in the procurement process. It is not a panacea by itself for accountability. It is the other extreme of the Central Tenders Board. Whereas the Central Tenders Board was a place where everything was lodged and there was a centralization of procurement, this procurement legislation puts everybody involved in it, most of whom might be people who were never involved in procurement before, and many of whom would see opportunities to play in their own local empires. So I'm putting you on notice that we need to go fast and furious with respect to our digitalization and our digitization of the country. There will be changes and there must be changes. And this whole question of the institutional strengthening are things that will form part of our natural way forward. Having said that, I think I have said enough for the day. I think the Minister of Finance has given away enough of his budget without giving us any numbers. And I think your inputs have been very valuable, and the day has been largely well spent. I want to thank you for the opportunity to have made those comments to you. And I simply want to say to my fellow citizens, tough times don't last forever, but tough people do. We in Trinidad and Tobago, we are tough people with a long history of resilience, and we are now called upon to be more resilient than ever. Thank you for your opportunity.
May be seated. Thank you so very much, Honorable Prime Minister Dr. Keith Rowley. Well, we have come to the end of our proceedings today. Very informative, very enlightening. I think a clearer picture was painted based on where we are and what needs to be done. And as I said, as we began the panel discussion, we can weather the storm because we have done it in the past, and we have confidence that the leadership can take us forward to where we need to be. At this time, I would like to thank our distinguished panel industry leaders for being a part of our discussion and our event today. Ms. Karen Darbesi, President of the Bankers Association of Trinidad and Tobago. Mr. Mark Loquan, President of the National Gas Company. Professor Jerry Brooks, Co-Chair of the Roadmap to Recovery Committee. Business Executive Christian Mute. Of course, the Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Finance, Mr. Vishnu Danpal. And the Honorable Minister of Finance, Mr. Colum Imber. Thank you so very much, ladies and gentlemen, for all of you in our live audience, those of you that are viewing on television. Thank you so very much. My name is Ken Simmons. It was indeed an honor to be a part of this historic event, and we look forward to Budget 2021 this coming Monday. Thank you very much, and God bless.